At the divorce hearing, my husband was full of arrogance. "You will never touch my money again, Imani," he sneered, adjusting his custom-tailored suit. His mistress sat right behind him, smiling a venomous smile. "She does not deserve a single dime, Terrence," she whispered loud enough for the whole room to hear. But then the judge opened my letter. He skimmed the first page, then burst out laughing. He leaned back in his leather chair and quietly said, "Oh, this is good." Their faces went pale with fear. Terrence actually threw a crumpled $500 check at my feet just moments before that letter arrived. "Take it," he demanded, looking down his nose at me. "Buy yourself some cheap groceries for the month, you absolute failure." Paige flipped her blonde hair and looked at me with pure disgust. "Maybe use it to get those messy locks done," she giggled, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "They look completely unprofessional for a courtroom." I stood there in my crisp white suit, perfectly composed. My dark skin glowed under the fluorescent lights, and my locks were immaculately styled into a crown. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I just looked at the two people who thought they had buried me alive. They had no idea I was the one holding the shovel. Exactly 6 months earlier, my world had violently cracked open. I work as a senior forensic accountant investigating financial fraud for major corporations. I spot hidden money for a living. I notice details everyone else misses. But somehow I missed the massive fraud happening inside my own marriage. It was a random Tuesday afternoon when I decided to surprise Terrence at his investment firm. He was a vice president there, a rising star in the financial world. Our families considered him the pinnacle of black excellence. I brought him his favorite lunch from that overpriced bistro downtown. When I reached his corner office, his secretary was nowhere to be seen. The heavy oak door was locked. I heard a strange thud against the wood, followed by a high-pitched giggle that made my stomach drop. My instincts flared. I did not knock gently. I dropped the food and kicked that heavy door open with everything I had. The lock splintered, and the door slammed against the wall. The scene inside was burned into my retinas forever. Terrence was leaning over his massive mahogany desk. Paige was sprawled across it. Paige was not just some random woman. She was the younger sister of my white brother-in-law Carter. She was family by marriage, a 25-year-old girl who played tennis with my light-skinned sister Aaliyah every weekend and smiled in my face at family dinners. When the door crashed open, Paige did not scream. She did not grab her clothes to cover her pale skin. She simply sat up, pulled her blonde hair over her shoulder, and smirked right at me. It was a look of pure, entitled victory. Terrence did not jump back in horror. He did not beg for forgiveness. He calmly reached for his tie, tightening the knot at his collar. He looked at me not with guilt, but with extreme irritation. "You really should have called my secretary first, Imani," he said, his voice cold and completely void of emotion. "You know I hate unannounced interruptions during business hours." I stood there paralyzed by the sheer audacity of his response. My husband of 6 years was treating me like a disruptive employee. "Get out of my office," Imani Terrence commanded, pointing toward the hallway. "We will discuss your lack of boundaries at home." Paige let out a soft laugh, sliding off the desk and grabbing her silk blouse. "Do not be too hard on her, Terrence," she cooed, buttoning her shirt. "It must be hard knowing she can never give you what I can." I did not shed a single tear. Crying would give them power. Crying would mean they broke me. I turned around and walked straight to the private executive parking garage. My hands were shaking, but my mind was operating with terrifying clarity. I popped the trunk of Terrence's luxury SUV. His prized custom golf clubs were sitting right there, the ones he bragged about to all his wealthy friends at the country club. I pulled them out one by one and launched them into the concrete wall of the parking garage. The snapping of graphite and titanium echoed through the empty space. I threw the shattered pieces into the back of my car, slammed the trunk, and sped out of the garage. I needed my family. I needed my mother, Vivian. She had always been tough on me, but a mother protects her child when a man disrespects her this badly. I drove straight to the affluent neighborhood where my mother lived. I was ready to fall into her arms and tell her how her precious son-in-law had humiliated me with a white woman. I wanted her to rally our family to stand by my side and help me pack my bags. I pulled into her circular driveway, tires screeching against the pavement. I ran up the brick steps and pounded on the heavy double doors. The door swung open. Vivian stood there wearing her silk lounge robe, perfectly put together as always. "Mom." I started, my voice finally cracking under the weight of the betrayal. "Terrence's—" I stopped. The words died in my throat. I looked past my mother into the sunken living room of her immaculate house. Terrence was sitting on her expensive cream-colored sofa, his legs crossed comfortably. He was holding a crystal glass of my father's vintage scotch. He looked up at me and took a slow, deliberate sip. Vivian did not look surprised to see me crying. She looked annoyed. "Close the door, Imani," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "You are letting the cold air in, and you are making a scene for the neighbors." I stood frozen on the welcome mat, unable to comprehend the nightmare unfolding before my eyes. My own mother had warmly welcomed the cruel man who just shattered my heart into her sanctuary. She freely offered him a cold drink while I stood outside shivering and completely broken inside my very soul. I stepped inside, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind me. The metallic click of the brass lock sounded exactly like a heavy prison gate permanently sealing my unfortunate fate. Terrence did not even flinch when I entered the room. He simply swirled the expensive amber liquid in his crystal glass and gave me a chilling look of absolute mild boredom. I looked from his arrogant face to my own mother desperately gasping for air. "Mom," he was literally on his office desk with Paige. "I caught them doing it. I need you to help me pack my things right now." Vivian set her glass down on the polished wooden table. She walked slowly toward me, her expensive silk robe flowing gracefully around her ankles. I genuinely expected a warm, comforting hug, but instead, her hand swung violently hard, striking my left cheek. The sharp, burning sting radiated across my face instantly. The heavy silence that followed the slap was deafening. The grand living room with its imported Italian marble floors and ridiculously oversized crystal chandeliers felt like a suffocating padded cell. I could hear the faint ticking of the vintage grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the exact second my entire family officially betrayed me. The metallic taste of blood slowly pooled inside my mouth from where my teeth had accidentally bitten into the soft inner flesh of my cheek. I refused to wipe the single tear that betrayed my stoic facade as it tracked slowly down my face. My mother just stared at me, breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling beneath the expensive silk fabric. "Are you seriously making a massive scene over a young white girl, Imani?" She hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "Are you actually throwing away your entire marriage over something so unbelievably trivial? Terrence is a highly respected corporate vice president, successful wealthy black men stray. It is a fundamental fact of life. You are incredibly foolish to constantly demand flawless perfection from a busy man of his high social caliber." "You are defending him," I whispered, my voice breaking completely. "He humiliated me in his office." My mother scoffed loudly. "Look at yourself, Imani. Just look at your incredibly dark skin and those heavy natural locks. You stubbornly refuse to soften your harsh professional image. You are so lucky a high society light-skinned man like Terrence even married you. Men with his elite pedigree do not usually settle down for women who look exactly like you. You should be thanking God every single day, instead of throwing ridiculous emotional tantrums." The cruel words sliced deep into my soul. This was the exact same woman who used to relentlessly bleach my skin and force burning chemical relaxers onto my sensitive scalp. Heavy footsteps echoed loudly down the grand marble stairs. My older sister Aaliyah suddenly appeared. Her fresh, expensive silk press bounced perfectly around her shoulders. She looked deeply annoyed by my presence. "Mom is completely right," Aaliyah said, standing firmly beside Terrence. "You are overreacting again, Imani. Terrence generously funds our entire lavish lifestyle. He literally paid off Mom's massive mortgage and fully financed my new fashion boutique. Do not ruin this amazing setup for us because of your own deep-seated personal insecurities. You are actually taking his side, I asked. He is currently sleeping with Paige, your own husband's younger sister. Aaliyah rolled her eyes in frustration. Paige is just very impulsive. Terrence is simply having some harmless fun. It genuinely means absolutely nothing. You clearly have the wedding ring. Stop acting like a helpless victim. If you actually took better care of your appearance, maybe he would not actively stray. My vision suddenly blurred with intense, blinding rage. I opened my mouth to scream loudly when a totally new voice cut right through the thick tension. Actually, it means a lot more than just fun. Carter, my wealthy white brother-in-law, strolled proudly out of the large kitchen. The ruthless real estate developer absolutely loved playing the white savior to our struggling family. He smirked broadly, looking exactly like he had just won the massive state lottery. "What on earth are you talking about, Carter?" I demanded. "Paige just called me directly," he said. She was crying hysterically because some crazy, angry woman kicked a heavy door in. But she also shared some truly wonderful news tonight. Carter looked directly at my smiling mother. Paige is actually pregnant. She is currently carrying Terrence's first child. The solid wooden floor instantly dropped out from underneath me. I looked quickly at my mother, expecting to see immediate outrage. Instead, Vivian audibly gasped with overwhelming pure delight. "A new baby," Vivian whispered softly. "Oh, Terrence, a beautiful mixed child. With Paige's straight blonde hair and your handsome features, the baby will surely have gorgeous light eyes and very good soft hair. This is truly an amazing blessing." My own birth mother was joyfully celebrating the absolute destruction of my loyal marriage because it perfectly elevated her twisted, lifelong obsession with whiteness. Aaliyah happily clapped her hands, loudly squealing that we were all truly one big connected family now. "You are all completely sick," I gasped. "I am filing for a messy public divorce early tomorrow. I will legally take him for absolutely everything." Carter stepped forward, aggressively closing the small distance until I abruptly hit the heavy front door. "You will sign a very quiet divorce," Imani Carter whispered lethally. "You will walk away immediately without a single complaint." And if I do not, I glared fiercely. Carter leaned dangerously closer. "If you do not, I will instantly call your firm. I play golf weekly with your powerful board. I will say you are mentally unstable. I will officially mention fake financial discrepancies in your past audits. I will ruthlessly use my extensive board connections to ensure you never ever work in forensic accounting in this country again. Sign the damn papers or I will brutally strip you of absolutely everything." I looked at my mother, who quickly looked away. I looked at Terrence, who smugly raised his glass. I turned the cold doorknob and walked out into the freezing night. They foolishly thought they won, but they forgot I actively track dirty financial secrets for a living. Starting tomorrow morning, I would methodically hunt down theirs and burn them to absolute ashes. The next morning, I woke up long before the sun even breached the horizon. I refused to let the horrific events of the previous night break my daily routine or shatter my spirit. I showered and dressed in my sharpest tailored navy blue suit. I smoothed down my locks and made sure my appearance was completely flawless. I walked out of my apartment building and headed to my favorite local cafe on the corner. It was my morning sanctuary, a quiet place where I usually prepared my mind for the day of untangling complex corporate frauds and hidden ledgers. I stepped up to the counter and ordered my usual black coffee. The young barista smiled warmly and swiped my debit card through the machine. The terminal beeped with a harsh, rejected tone. "I am so sorry, but it was declined," she said softly, looking incredibly apologetic. I frowned slightly and handed her my main credit card instead, assuming it was just a simple bank error. The machine beeped again. Declined. A cold, heavy knot formed instantly in the pit of my stomach. I stepped aside politely and pulled up my secure banking application on my phone. The screen slowly loaded and the numbers stared back at me like a cruel, vicious joke. 0. Every single joint account I shared with Terrence had been completely drained, My checking account, my emergency savings, and the massive fund we had built together over 6 long years of marriage were entirely wiped out. $400,000 was just gone. The detailed transfer history showed a massive wire movement transferring every single penny into an unknown offshore account at 3 in the morning. Terrence had not just cheated on me with his mistresses in his office. He was actively engaging in financial warfare against his own wife. He wanted to leave me absolutely destitute, desperate, and begging on my knees. I left the hot coffee sitting on the counter and walked out into the crisp morning air. I told myself to breathe. I still had my brilliant career. I still had my own separate corporate income to rely on. Or so I foolishly thought. I drove straight to the downtown glass high-rise that housed my elite forensic accounting firm. This place was my true home. I was a senior partner in all but the official title. I had spent 10 relentless years building an immaculate, spotless reputation for sniffing out massive corporate embezzlement and sophisticated financial theft. I walked through the revolving glass doors with my head held high and approached the secure security turnstiles in the grand lobby. I tapped my identification badge against the electronic scanner, just like I did every single morning. A flashing red light suddenly appeared, accompanied by a loud, sharp buzzing sound. Access denied. I tried tapping the card again, thinking it was a glitch. Denied. Before I could even turn to ask the front desk receptionist for assistance, 2 burly armed security guards stepped directly into my path, blocking my way. They flanked a nervous-looking woman from our human resources department who was tightly holding a cheap brown cardboard box. "Imani, we need you to step back," she said, looking everywhere but directly at my face. "We need you to surrender your corporate phone and your office keys immediately. You are being placed on an indefinite unpaid administrative leave pending a massive internal investigation." I stood perfectly still while my heart pounded against my ribs. An investigation for exactly what I asked, my voice remaining dangerously calm, despite the panic rising in my throat. She shifted her weight nervously from side to side. "We received an anonymous tip late last night that was heavily flagged by a major board member. The tip included detailed allegations of severe financial discrepancies in your recent corporate audits. They are formally accusing you of manipulating client funds for personal gain. Carter." The realization hit me with the destructive force of a freight train. Carter had rapidly followed through on his vicious threat from last night. He used his wealthy real estate connections and his powerful golf buddies on our board of directors to completely frame me. He had maliciously orchestrated a phantom investigation to strip me of my livelihood and destroy my hard-earned professional credibility. The security guards marched forward and physically escorted me out of the glass building while my colleagues and peers watched from the lobby in stunned, awkward silence. I was handed the cardboard box containing a framed photo of my late father, my favorite coffee mug, and a few personal desk items. I was 34 years old. In less than 12 hours, my husband had impregnated his mistresses. My own mother had chosen his side. My bank accounts were emptied to zero, and my flawless career was completely destroyed. I walked to my car in a total daze. I sat in the driver's seat staring blankly at the leather steering wheel. The concrete silence of the parking garage was heavy and suffocating. That is when my cell phone began to ring loudly in the cup holder. The caller identification showed Aaliyah. I answered the phone without saying a single word. "Imani, you need to get here right now," my sister demanded immediately. Her tone was dripping with absolute entitlement and was completely devoid of any basic empathy for the nightmare I was currently living through. "Where exactly is here?" I asked, letting my voice sound perfectly flat and emotionless. "Le Petit," she answered casually, naming the most exclusive and absurdly expensive French restaurant in the entire city. "We are having a nice family dinner. You need to come down here right now and officially apologize to Paige." I gripped the phone tighter. "Apologize to the woman currently sleeping with my husband?" I asked, wondering if my sister had completely lost her mind. Paige is highly stressed about her pregnancy because of your unnecessary crazy drama last night, Aaliyah snapped angrily. Carter is absolutely furious with you. He says you are being incredibly difficult and stubborn. Mom says if you do not come down here right now and make amends with everyone, she will officially disown you and cut you out of the family completely. Do not ruin this perfect lifestyle for us, Imani. Just swallow your pride and get here. They fully expected me to be shattered into a million pieces. They expected me to show up at that fancy restaurant with tears streaming down my face, begging for forgiveness, and desperately asking for my family back. They wanted me to bow my head low and accept my designated place as the discarded dark-skinned sister who was simply not good enough for the high society life they all blindly worshipped. I looked down at the passenger seat. Sitting right next to my cardboard box of personal desk items was my heavy encrypted work laptop. It was the one crucial item human resources had forgotten to demand I return in their rush to escort me out. It was the powerful machine that contained the most advanced financial tracking software in the forensic accounting industry. I did not shed a single tear for Terrence or my mother or my sister. I did not scream or hit the dashboard in frustration. A terrifying and absolute calm washed over my entire body, settling deep into my bones. I am on my way, I told Aaliyah, and I hung up the phone without waiting for her response. I grabbed the encrypted laptop and placed it securely in my bag. I started the engine and pulled out of the dark parking garage into the bright afternoon light. I was driving straight to Le Petit, but I was certainly not going there to apologize or beg for their scraps. I was going to hunt. Le Petit was the kind of establishment that prided itself on pure exclusivity. Crystal chandeliers dripped from vaulted ceilings, and the scent of expensive truffle butter hung heavy in the cool air. I handed my car keys to the valet and walked through the heavy glass doors, clutching my leather laptop bag. The tall maitre d' gave my tailored suit a respectful nod before guiding me toward the private dining area. I could hear them laughing loudly before I even saw them. Paige's high-pitched laughter echoed obnoxiously over the soft classical music playing in the background. They were seated at the absolute best table in the room, a large round booth draped in white linen right next to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My mother Vivian sat at the head of the table, happily pouring expensive champagne into crystal flutes. Terrence sat to her right, with Paige tucked tightly against his side. Carter and my sister Aaliyah sat across from them, looking like a picture-perfect wealthy couple without a single care in the entire world. I walked toward their table, my face a blank mask of complete indifference. Before I could even reach out to pull an empty chair away from the table, my mother abruptly stood up. She held her manicured hand out flat like a traffic cop stopping a speeding car. "You are not sitting with us, Imani," she declared, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the neighboring tables could clearly hear. Vivian pointed her finger toward a tiny, wobbly overflow table shoved into the dark corner near the swinging kitchen doors. "You can sit over there by yourself," she commanded. "Paige is currently in a very delicate condition, and your dark, bitter energy is incredibly bad for the baby. We cannot risk you causing her any undue stress with your ridiculous accusations and generally hostile attitude." Aaliyah nodded in agreement while slowly sipping her golden champagne. "Just sit in the corner, Imani, and behave yourself tonight. Maybe if you sit quietly and deeply reflect on your poor actions, Terrence will be generous enough to cover your dinner bill, since you are entirely broke now." Terrence did not even bother to look in my direction. He was entirely too busy caressing Paige's pale hand and whispering in her ear. Carter smirked widely, resting his arm casually over the back of his expensive velvet chair. I did not argue with them. I did not cause the massive, embarrassing scene they were so desperately hoping for. I simply turned around and walked over to the tiny table by the swinging kitchen doors. I sat down on the hard wooden chair and carefully placed my heavy leather bag on the tabletop. The waiter approached, looking incredibly uncomfortable, but I simply ordered a glass of tap water. I certainly did not come here to eat their food or listen to their insults. I came here to work. I pulled my encrypted laptop from the bag and flipped the screen open. The soft blue glow of the monitor illuminated my face in the dim corner of the bustling restaurant. From across the room, I could hear Paige bragging loudly about her sudden good fortune. Her voice was specifically pitched to ensure I heard every single painful word. Terrence is just the most amazing provider, she gushed excitedly, clapping her hands together. He just wired $50,000 to the top interior designer in the city to do the nursery for our child. We are doing imported Italian silk wallpaper and a custom-built mahogany crib. He wants our sweet baby to have absolutely everything money can buy. Terrence smiled proudly, gently kissing her cheek. Only the absolute best for my new family, he boasted loudly to the table. My blood ran completely cold, but my fingers moved with lightning speed across the keyboard. $50,000 for a nursery. He had drained $400,000 from our joint accounts less than 24 hours ago. I connected to the restaurant's secure wireless network and engaged my military-grade virtual private network. I smoothly bypassed the standard security protocols and immediately accessed the back door of our shared banking portal. I easily extracted the raw transaction data from his massive withdrawal. I am a seasoned forensic accountant. Arrogant men like Terrence always think they are fundamentally smarter than the women they marry. They foolishly think hiding money is a simple game of moving cash from point A to point B. But money always leaves a digital footprint, and I am unequivocally the best tracker in the entire business. I ran the routing numbers through my custom tracing software. The program began chewing aggressively through the dense layers of banking encryption. Terrence had not just moved the money into a simple domestic account. He had carefully wired it through a highly complex labyrinth of digital funnels. I watched the bright green code scroll rapidly across my black screen as the software tracked the $400,000 bouncing from a bank in Delaware to a holding account in Luxembourg and finally settling securely into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I tapped my fingernail impatiently against the table, waiting for the software to crack the shell company ownership records. Paige was still loudly listing the expensive baby clothes she planned to buy tomorrow. Vivian was praising Terrence for his outstanding financial acumen and brilliant investment strategies. They genuinely thought he was a financial genius. They honestly thought he was completely untouchable. The software chimed softly. The official ownership documents for the Cayman Islands account flashed onto my screen. I leaned closer, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon. The money did not go to Paige. It did not go into a private trust for their new baby either. The account belonged to a massive web of offshore shell companies jointly owned and directly operated by Terrence and Carter. My breathing slowed as I bypassed their final corporate firewall. My eyes widened in shock. The offshore balance was $15 million. To operate a fund of this magnitude, you need a proxy. I highlighted the name of the registered owner holding the $15 million empire. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. The legal proxy was Jamal, my deceased working-class black father, a man Vivian always despised. I stared at the glowing green text on my screen. The name was impossible to misread. Jamal. The man who worked 50 hours a week at the auto plant to make sure I had school shoes. The man Vivian sneered at for never making a six-figure salary. Now his stolen identity was sitting on a digital offshore ledger guarding $15 million of dirty money for the two men who destroyed my life. A wave of pure disgust washed over me. Terrence and Carter had not just betrayed my marriage and my career. They had deeply violated the sacred memory of the only parent who ever loved me. I slowly closed the laptop. The click of the metal latch was the only sound at my isolated corner table. I slid the computer into my leather bag and stood up. I smoothed the wrinkles from my white skirt and took a long, deep, steadying breath. I walked across the crowded dining room with deliberate steps. The clinking of expensive silverware against fine china faded into a dull hum as I approached their large booth by the window. I felt the heat of anger radiating from my chest, but my face remained a perfect mask of cold indifference. I stood directly right behind Terrence. He was telling a loud joke, laughing with Carter, while Paige rested her head on his shoulder. I leaned down just inches from his ear. I did not mention the $15 million. I did not mention the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I kept my voice incredibly soft and dangerously calm. Why is my dead father's social security number listed as an active proxy in your private financial files, Terrence? The laughter died instantly. Terrence stiffened his body, his hand freezing halfway to his wine glass. Aaliyah frowned, looking back and forth between us with confusion. Vivian let out a dramatic sigh, clearly annoyed that I had dared to interrupt their evening. Paige shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Carter, however, did not look panicked at all. The real estate developer calmly reached for a white linen napkin and slowly wiped his mouth. Carter let out a low, amused chuckle, leaning back comfortably in his velvet chair. He looked at me with relaxed confidence as if I was a minor inconvenience. "Your dad died with terrible credit, Imani," he said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. But his tax records were clean. Terrence and I just borrowed his identity for some standard offshore tax optimization. It is a common business practice for high-level developers protecting their assets. What exactly are you going to do about it? Are you going to cry to the Internal Revenue Service and tell them your dead father is somehow hiding money overseas? Terrence quickly regained his composure, emboldened by Carter's lack of fear. He realized I only had a piece of the puzzle and decided to use this moment to crush me entirely. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick folded legal document. He slapped it hard onto the white tablecloth next to his champagne flute. "This is a final divorce settlement," he stated, his voice dripping with pure arrogance. "I had my lawyers draft it this morning after you caused that violent scene in my corporate office." He tapped his manicured finger against the thick paper. "You just sign this right now, and you get to keep the 10-year-old Honda Civic you drove here in. I will also be generous enough to give you exactly $1,000 a month in alimony for a single year so you do not end up sleeping on the streets. If you refuse to sign it, I will drag you through a brutal public court battle. You are currently suspended from your firm without pay. You have no access to our joint banking accounts. You have no money for a lawyer. You have absolutely nothing left, Imani. Fight me and you will get nothing at all." I looked around the table. Paige smiled a wicked smile, tracing the rim of her glass with a manicured finger. Vivian looked at me coldly, nodding her head in complete agreement with Terrence as if he was offering me a massive favor. Aaliyah crossed her arms, waiting for me to break down and beg for a better deal. They all thought I was entirely trapped. They thought I was a desperate, humiliated woman with zero options and zero power. I looked down at the settlement papers resting on the white linen. Then I looked at the smug faces of my mother, my sister, my soon-to-be ex-husband, and the white man who thought he could use my dead father's name as a convenient criminal shield. I reached into my purse and pulled out a simple black ink pen. I did not argue with a single word they said. I did not try to negotiate for a better financial offer. I did not shed a single tear. I grabbed the document, flipped directly to the last page, and signed my name on the dotted line with quick, decisive strokes. Terrence gasped in genuine surprise. He blinked rapidly, staring down at my fresh signature on the heavy paper. A slow, triumphant smirk spread across his handsome face. He genuinely thought he had completely broken my spirit. He thought I was surrendering to his overwhelming power and accepting my total defeat. Carter chuckled loudly, raising his glass in a silent mock toast to my absolute misery. I dropped the black pen onto the table next to his dinner plate. I picked up my leather bag containing the encrypted laptop and turned my back on them. I walked straight out of the elegant restaurant, pushing through the heavy glass double doors into the cool, crisp night air. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I bypassed my personal contacts and dialed a direct, unlisted federal government number I knew completely by heart. I listened to it ring exactly twice before a stern, professional voice answered the line. "Yes," I said, my voice perfectly steady and totally fearless. "I need to speak immediately with a senior intake agent at the whistleblower office. I have a massive corporate fraud and international money laundering case to officially report." I sat in a sterile, brightly lit federal office located deep within the heavily fortified Internal Revenue Service building. The heavy steel door was locked securely behind me, creating an atmosphere of absolute silence and total secrecy. Across the cold metal desk sat two senior agents from the Criminal Investigation Division. Their faces were carved from stone, entirely unreadable, as they carefully reviewed the massive stack of documents I had just provided. I handed over my encrypted flash drive containing the complete offshore account ledgers, the hidden transaction histories, and the undeniable proof of massive corporate fraud. I watched their eyes widen fractionally as the sheer magnitude of the theft became apparent on their secure monitors. I calmly explained the fatal, arrogant mistake Carter and Terrence had made when they chose to use my dead father's identity. Jamal died with absolutely nothing to his name except a clean tax record and a mountain of unpaid medical debt. He was a hardworking man who broke his back every single day just to put food on our table, while Vivian constantly belittled him for not being a wealthy executive. My mother, Vivian, had divorced him decades ago, erasing any legal tie she had to his meager estate. Carter and Terrence foolishly assumed a dead-broke black man from the working class would never trigger a federal audit. They thought his ghost was the perfect untraceable proxy for their $15 million black money fund. But they completely forgot one crucial legal detail that would absolutely destroy them. As his only living blood relative, I had total absolute legal authority over his entire estate. I was his sole legal heir. Because they had placed the limited liability company entirely in his name, they had inadvertently handed me the keys to their entire kingdom. Sitting in that quiet federal office, I formally and legally initiated a hostile takeover of the fraudulent offshore company. I claimed rightful ownership of the $15 million. I reached across the desk and signed the formal whistleblower documents, pushing them back to the older agent. I detailed exactly how their elaborate criminal scheme operated. I showed the agents how Carter used his massive commercial real estate developments to artificially inflate supply costs and wash dirty money through fake contractor invoices. I proved how Terrence then manipulated his prestigious corporate investment fund to funnel the newly cleaned cash directly into the Cayman Islands accounts. They were systematically dodging millions of dollars in federal taxes and brazenly laundering corporate funds through my father's stolen name. The older agent slowly took off his reading glasses and looked up at me with genuine professional respect. My flawless forensic accounting work had handed them an absolute gift. The evidence I provided was entirely bulletproof and completely ready for prosecution. The younger federal agent leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal desk. He explained the grim reality of taking down wealthy, high-profile corporate criminals. He told me it would take exactly 5 months to completely untangle the complex web of shell companies and build the airtight federal indictments required to raid their offices and freeze their domestic assets. 5 long months of absolute total silence. I had to play my part perfectly. I had to pretend Terrence had successfully broken me. I had to live exactly like the destitute, discarded, and completely humiliated wife they all believed me to be. If I showed any sign of sudden wealth or confidence, they might get suspicious and attempt to flee the country or destroy the remaining physical evidence. I had to wait patiently for the final divorce hearing before the trap could finally be sprung. I walked out of the towering federal building and stepped into my new temporary reality. I took the keys to the 10-year-old battered Honda Civic that Terrence had so generously allowed me to keep in his cruel divorce settlement. The engine rattled loudly as I turned the ignition, and the faded fabric seats were stained and torn. I drove away from the wealthy downtown district and headed straight to a cheap, run-down motel on the dusty industrial outskirts of the city. The faded neon sign buzzed loudly outside my ground-floor window, flashing a harsh red light into the cramped, depressing room. The mattress was incredibly thin. The cheap carpet was sticky, and the air smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning supplies. This bleak room was my designated sanctuary for the next 5 months. I spent my days working quietly as an independent contractor under an assumed name, slowly rebuilding my own private wealth. I ate cheap canned soup and drank tap water while my family lavishly celebrated my absolute financial ruin. The long, agonizing months dragged by with torturous slowness. I ignored their occasional gloating messages and maintained my pathetic facade with absolute precision. Aaliyah would text me photos of her new designer handbags bought with Terrence's money. Carter would send condescending emails offering to hire me as a basic bookkeeper for minimum wage just to rub salt in my deep wounds. I swallowed my heavy pride and responded with meek apologies, playing the broken victim flawlessly. I knew every single day that passed brought them one step closer to federal prison. Then late one Tuesday evening, my phone buzzed loudly on the cheap motel nightstand. The screen lit up with a new message from my mother, Vivian. I opened the text and read the harsh words slowly. "Since you are completely broke and living like a common peasant, you can finally earn your keep," she wrote, her words dripping with her familiar toxic venom. "We are hosting a massive high society dinner at the estate. All of Carter's wealthy investors and Terrence's powerful board members will be there. You are serving the food at Thanksgiving this year. Wear a plain black dress and enter through the kitchen. Do not speak to any of the guests unless you are directly spoken to." I stared at the glowing screen while the neon sign buzzed outside my window. Thanksgiving was exactly 2 weeks before the final divorce hearing. It was the absolute perfect stage. Vivian wanted to parade her wealthy, successful family in front of the city elite, while forcing her dark-skinned daughter to carry trays of appetizers like a hired servant. She wanted to show everyone that Paige was the perfect new addition to their flawless high society life, while I was finally put in my proper place of servitude. I pictured Terrence smugly drinking expensive wine and Carter laughing about his brilliant offshore accounts. They were entirely oblivious to the federal agents currently building an inescapable steel cage around their entire privileged existence. I typed my simple response with a cold, calculating smile forming on my lips. "I will be there." I parked my severely battered Honda Civic near the massive iron security gates of Carter's sprawling suburban estate. The brisk November wind bit sharply through my thin wool coat as I walked up the long, winding asphalt driveway. I did not dare park anywhere near the shiny luxury sedans and imported sports cars lining the grand main entrance. I followed my mother's strict, cruel instructions and made my way around the side of the massive stone mansion. I stepped carefully through the perfectly manicured landscaping to reach the heavy steel door of the rear service entrance. I pushed the door open and stepped immediately into the chaotic, sweltering heat of the industrial catering kitchen. Hired workers in crisp white uniforms rushed frantically past me, carrying massive silver trays of expensive steaming food. Aaliyah was standing near a large marble island holding a clipboard and looking incredibly stressed and deeply annoyed. She wore a stunning emerald green designer gown that perfectly hugged her figure and sparkled under the bright kitchen lights. When she finally noticed me standing quietly by the door, she let out a loud, dramatic sigh of pure frustration. She walked over and shoved a cheap white cotton apron hard against my chest. "Put this on immediately, Imani," she snapped, her voice tight with unyielding authority. "You are incredibly late and we are severely understaffed tonight. Take a tray of the caviar appetizers and start circling the main dining room right now. And listen to me carefully," she said, leaning in so close that her expensive floral perfume was thick and suffocating in my throat. "Do not dare mingle with Carter's wealthy investors in the living room. Keep your head down, serve the food, and do not speak to anyone unless they ask you a direct question about the menu. We absolutely cannot afford your dark, depressing, broken energy, ruining this crucial night for my husband." I tied the cheap white strings of the apron behind my back without saying a single word in my defense. I grabbed a heavy silver tray loaded with delicate, expensive appetizers and pushed my way through the swinging wooden doors into the grand living room. The space was absolutely massive, featuring high vaulted ceilings and a roaring stone fireplace that bathed the room in a warm golden glow. Wealthy men in expensive tailored suits and women draped in heavy, shimmering jewelry stood in small, intimate circles, holding crystal glasses of vintage champagne. I kept my eyes focused firmly on the polished hardwood floor, stepping silently and invisibly between the wealthy guests offering food with a blank, expressionless face. I was nothing but a ghost in my own family's house. I slowly made my way toward the large velvet sofas positioned near the crackling fire. Vivian was sitting directly in the center holding court with a group of older, wealthy society women. Paige sat comfortably next to her looking radiant and smug in a soft pink maternity dress. Terrence stood proudly behind the sofa, resting his hand gently and protectively on Paige's shoulder. I stopped just a few feet away, turning my back slightly, pretending to arrange the cloth napkins on my silver tray. Vivian reached out and lovingly stroked Paige's straight blonde hair. "I just cannot wait for this precious baby to arrive." Vivian gushed loudly, ensuring everyone around them could clearly hear her pure delight. With Paige's soft, delicate features and Terrence's handsome profile, this child is going to be absolutely breathtaking. Light eyes and good soft hair. Vivian continued, her voice dripping with absolute adoration. "It will beautifully elevate our entire family line. We desperately need a child exactly like this to finally wash away Jamal's strong, heavy genes. Just look at how Imani turned out. We certainly do not need another dark, angry, stubborn child running around ruining our perfect family image." The society women around the velvet sofa laughed politely, sipping their golden champagne as if my mother had just told a delightful joke. Paige beamed brightly, resting her pale hand protectively over her slightly swollen stomach. Terrence chuckled loudly, leaning down to kiss Paige's blonde head in front of everyone. He did not even glance in my direction. He simply did not care that my own mother was ruthlessly attacking my dead father and my dark skin in front of a room full of wealthy strangers. My hands gripped the edges of the heavy silver tray so hard my knuckles turned completely white. I swallowed the bitter metallic taste of pure rage pooling deep in the back of my throat. I forced my feet to move, stepping away from the velvet sofas and gliding silently toward the heavy oak doors of the private billiard room. Carter and Terrence were standing near a large mahogany wet bar, surrounded by four older white men I recognized instantly from my forensic corporate files. They were the most powerful and ruthless real estate investors in the entire state. I approached the group, slowly holding out my silver tray of expensive caviar and smoked salmon. The men ignored me completely, treating me exactly like a piece of invisible moving furniture. They were already several drinks deep, their voices loud and utterly reckless with arrogant confidence. "This luxury resort deal is going to absolutely change the entire financial landscape of the city," Carter boasted, proudly swirling the amber liquid in his heavy crystal glass. $20 million cash closing first thing tomorrow morning. The investors nodded their heads in greedy approval. Terrence smiled his signature slick corporate smile, clapping Carter hard on the shoulder. "We have the entire financial pipeline completely sanitized and ready to flow." Terrence added, his voice low but easily audible over the soft jazz music playing in the room. "The 20 million is bypassing the domestic corporate structure entirely. We are funneling the entire massive sum straight through our private Cayman proxy first thing tomorrow morning on Black Friday. The domestic banks will be completely overwhelmed with the massive holiday wire traffic. It will slip through the international cracks completely unnoticed and land safely in our offshore accounts by noon." One of the older investors laughed loudly, raising his glass in a celebratory toast. To the Cayman proxy, he cheered happily. Carter and Terrence clinked their glasses together, drinking deeply to their massive hidden wealth and their brilliant, untouchable fraud. I stood perfectly still, holding the silver tray while my mind raced with absolute clarity. The $20 million was moving tomorrow morning. It was funneling directly into the offshore limited liability company currently registered under Jamal's stolen identity. It was funneling directly into the exact same holding company that I now legally owned and completely controlled. A cold, dangerous thrill washed over my entire body. I did not need to do anything to stop them. I just needed to let their blinding greed blind them to the trap. I needed them to push that button and execute the massive international wire transfer tomorrow morning before they ever realized their precious Cayman proxy had been entirely hijacked by the exact same dark-skinned woman they were currently forcing to serve them appetizers. They thought I was a broken, destitute servant. They had absolutely no idea they were about to willingly hand me $20 million of their own stolen money. I stood perfectly still, holding the heavy silver tray, while the jazz music continued to play softly in the background. The reality of what I had just heard echoed loudly in my mind. $20 million of completely untraceable black money was going to hit my offshore accounts tomorrow morning. Carter and Terrence were so drunk on their own absolute power that they freely confessed their entire criminal enterprise in front of a woman they considered entirely invisible. They truly believed I was nothing but a broken, desperate servant completely defeated by their overwhelming wealth. I watched them clink their heavy crystal glasses together, celebrating the massive wire transfer they were about to authorize. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask of cold submission. I just needed to survive the rest of this night without raising a single suspicion. I needed to let them wake up tomorrow and blindly push the button that would legally transfer their entire corrupt fortune directly into my waiting hands. Carter suddenly turned away from his wealthy investors and locked his cold, arrogant eyes directly onto me. His face was flushed red from the expensive vintage bourbon, and his expensive tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing his complete, absolute comfort in his own sprawling mansion. He looked me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust, as if I was a piece of trash that had somehow blown into his pristine home. He raised his right hand and snapped his thick fingers loudly in my direction. The sharp cracking sound sliced right through the soft ambient music and the low hum of wealthy conversation. It was the ultimate gesture of absolute disrespect. It was a command meant for a dog, not a human being. "Bring that tray over here and refill my glass immediately." He barked, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. He wanted an audience for this brutal public execution. He wanted Vivian and Paige and all of his powerful friends to watch him completely crush whatever tiny fragment of dignity I had left. I slowly walked forward, my cheap rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no sound against the expensive imported rugs. I lowered the heavy silver tray, presenting the remaining appetizers with my head bowed exactly like a properly obedient servant. Carter did not even look at the food. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his dark suit and pulled out a thick, heavy money clip. He peeled a crisp new $100 bill from the massive stack and casually tossed it onto my silver serving tray. It landed right next to a delicate caviar appetizer. "Buy yourself some nice clothes for the final divorce court hearing next week, Imani," he said loudly, his words dripping with pure mocking venom. "Try not to look completely homeless when you sit in front of the judge. You are embarrassing my entire family with this pathetic, destitute routine." The wealthy investors standing around the mahogany wet bar erupted into loud, roaring laughter. They chuckled into their crystal glasses, finding my absolute public humiliation incredibly entertaining. Terrence smiled his handsome, wicked smile, leaning casually against the bar and watching me squirm under their collective amusement. He genuinely thought he had completely won. He thought this exact moment was the absolute final destruction of my entire spirit. I stood frozen, looking down at the crisp green $100 bill resting on the silver tray. I thought about the $15 million already sitting safely in my offshore accounts. I thought about the $20 million that would be joining it tomorrow morning. I thought about the massive federal indictments currently being finalized in a secure government office downtown. Suddenly, the heavy, suffocating weight of playing the broken victim completely vanished. The burning hot rage I had been suppressing for 5 long months finally broke completely free. I realized I did not need to pretend anymore. They were going to make that wire transfer tomorrow morning regardless of what I did tonight, because their absolute greed would never allow them to delay a $20 million closing on Black Friday. The trap was already set and the steel door was already locked. I slowly reached down and picked up the crisp $100 bill. I did not say a single word. I simply turned my back on Carter and walked deliberately toward the center of the massive room. A large, ornate floral arrangement sat on a heavy oak table surrounded by tall, thick white candles burning brightly in the dim light. The entire room went completely silent as they watched me. The clinking of glasses stopped, and the laughter instantly died in their throats. I held the edge of the $100 bill directly over the open dancing flame of the tallest candle. The thick, expensive paper caught fire instantly. The bright orange and blue flames quickly devoured the green ink, spreading rapidly across the face of the bill and casting harsh, dancing shadows across my own face. I turned around and walked straight back to where Carter was standing. He was staring at me with his mouth slightly open, his arrogant smirk completely erased by sudden, genuine confusion. I held the burning money until the hot flames nearly blistered my bare fingers. Then I opened my hand and dropped the fiery remains directly into his half-empty crystal glass of vintage bourbon. The alcohol hissed loudly, sending up a thick, sudden plume of acrid black smoke that smelled strongly of burnt paper and charred sugar. A piercing, dramatic scream ripped through the silent room. Vivian had leaped up from her velvet sofa, her hands covering her mouth in absolute sheer horror. Paige immediately began gasping loudly, clutching her swollen stomach, and backing away as if I had just pulled out a loaded weapon. She hid behind Terrence, acting completely terrified for the safety of her precious unborn child. The wealthy society guests murmured in absolute shock, stepping away from me and whispering frantically to each other. I had completely shattered their perfect, elegant, high society illusion. Terrence lost his carefully constructed composure entirely. The slick, handsome corporate executive vanished, replaced by a furious, panicking man who realized he could no longer control me. "You are a complete psycho!" he yelled at the top of his lungs, his face turning a dark, angry purple. He stepped forward, pointing a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You are completely unhinged, Imani. You have absolutely lost your mind. I am calling my lawyers first thing tomorrow morning and making sure you get absolutely nothing in this divorce. You are going to starve on the streets. You will never see a single dime from me as long as you live." I stood perfectly still, watching his pathetic, frantic outburst with total cold indifference. His empty threats meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I reached behind my back and slowly untied the cheap white cotton apron. I pulled it over my head and let it drop heavily onto the polished hardwood floor, right at Carter's expensive Italian leather shoes. I slowly wiped my hands together as if I was dusting off years of accumulated filth and absolute disrespect. I looked directly into Carter's wide, shocked eyes. My voice was incredibly calm, perfectly even, and completely devoid of any fear. "I did not come here tonight for a pathetic tip, Carter," I said loudly, ensuring every single person in that massive room heard every single word. Then I turned my cold gaze directly onto Terrence. I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to take a tiny, defensive step backward. I stared at his left wrist. "I came here tonight to retrieve my dead father's vintage silver Rolex that you are currently wearing." Before Terrence could even register my words or attempt to pull his arm away, I moved with sudden, violent speed. I grabbed his left wrist hard, digging my fingernails directly into his skin, and forcefully yanked the heavy silver watch right off his arm. The metal clasp broke with a loud, sharp snap. Terrence gasped in sudden pain and shock, clutching his bare wrist and staring at me in total disbelief. I closed my fist tightly around the cold, heavy metal of my father's stolen watch. I did not look back at my screaming mother or the terrified Paige. I simply turned around and walked purposefully through the grand living room, straight out the heavy oak front doors, and stepped completely free into the cool, crisp, dark night air. The cold morning air slipped slowly through the thin cracks of the cheap motel window frame. I sat cross-legged on the faded floral bedspread, with my heavy, encrypted laptop resting securely on my knees. The glowing monitor cast a harsh blue light across the dark, exhausted circles under my eyes. I had barely slept a single wink since walking out of Carter's extravagant mansion last night. My dead father's vintage silver Rolex rested safely on the cheap laminate nightstand, right next to a cold, bitter cup of black diner coffee. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the secure offshore banking portal. The digital ledger for my father's legally inherited limited liability company showed a current balance of absolutely zero. I listened to the steady hum of the highway traffic outside my thin wooden door. Every passing car sounded like a rushing ocean wave in the quiet isolation of my bleak room. I traced the cracked glass of my father's heavy watch with my thumb, feeling the cold, solid metal ground me to reality. He had worked his entire life for absolute pennies, and now his stolen name was holding the master key to a massive criminal corporate empire. Somewhere across the sprawling city, I knew exactly what Terrence and Carter were doing. They were undoubtedly nursing massive, throbbing hangovers from their lavish high society Thanksgiving feast. They were likely sitting in a sleek glass corporate boardroom, drinking expensive imported water and laughing loudly about how incredibly clever they were. They genuinely believed they were completely untouchable kings of their own private corrupt universe. They thought they were simply moving $20 million into a dark, untraceable void where neither the federal government nor their own strict corporate boards could ever find it. Terrence especially wanted to ensure that every single penny of his newly laundered wealth was safely hidden far away from the legal jurisdiction of our final divorce hearing on Monday. He wanted me to stand before the stern judge with absolutely nothing, while he secretly controlled a massive international fortune. Carter was equally greedy, eager to wash his dirty commercial real estate money through a convenient ghost account. They had spent the entire holiday weekend bragging arrogantly about their brilliant Black Friday transfer. Their blinding absolute arrogance completely prevented them from seeing the massive federal trap waiting silently right beneath their expensive leather shoes. I repeatedly hit the refresh key on my plastic keyboard. The small digital clock in the bottom corner of my screen slowly ticked toward exactly 9 in the morning. That was the precise moment the international wire windows opened for the heavy holiday processing rush. The cheap motel radiator kicked on with a loud, harsh metallic clank, but I barely noticed the sudden disruptive noise. My entire universe was completely reduced to the tiny blinking cursor on the secure banking portal. I took a slow, deep, steadying breath and pressed the enter key one more time. The screen briefly went entirely blank as the highly secure servers communicated rapidly across the globe, bridging the massive technological gap between a cheap rundown motel in the Midwest and a highly secretive offshore bank in the sunny Caribbean. I rubbed my tired, burning eyes, waiting patiently for the complex page to properly render. I thought about my mother Vivian stroking Paige's blonde hair and brutally mocking my dark skin. I thought about Terrence throwing $100 bill at me like I was a worthless beggar on the street. All of their cruel insults and bitter betrayals fueled the steady, calm rhythm of my beating heart. Then the screen suddenly reloaded with a bright, vibrant green flash. The empty account balance had instantly changed. A large notification banner appeared reading Incoming International Wire Transfer Pending, $20 million. I stared at the incredible long string of bold zeros stretching across the bright digital screen. They had actually done it. Their insatiable, endless greed had led them directly into the waiting federal slaughterhouse. They had officially transferred the massive stolen fortune directly into the anonymous shell company that I now legally owned and completely controlled. I did not waste a single precious second celebrating this massive victory. I immediately opened the secondary highly encrypted software program provided directly to me by the senior agents at the whistleblower office. I rapidly typed in my secure federal authorization code and confidently executed the final system command. The screen flashed bright glowing red, indicating the complete and total freezing of all active offshore assets. The trap violently snapped shut with absolute undeniable legal finality. The federal government had officially seized the entire $20 million fund under my direct official whistleblower authorization. The money was permanently locked inside a digital federal vault, and the Internal Revenue Service now had irrefutable concrete proof of their massive international money laundering operation. The absolute heavy silence of the motel room was suddenly shattered by the harsh, loud ringing of my cell phone. The bright screen illuminated the dark room with Terrence's name flashing aggressively across the display. I let it ring 3 full times, savoring the absolute total desperation echoing in the electronic sound. He was finally realizing exactly what had just happened. The pristine walls of his perfect corporate life were rapidly caving in around his head. I slowly reached over and picked up the device, pressing the speaker button so his raw panic could fill the entire empty room. He did not even bother to say a basic polite greeting. His voice was high-pitched, completely breathless, and entirely unhinged with sheer, unfiltered terror. "Did you do something to my accounts, Imani?" He screamed frantically into the phone. His heavy, ragged breathing echoed loudly through the small plastic speaker. "My offshore proxy is completely locked down, and the bank is flatly refusing to release the pending funds. Tell me you did not mess with my private computer files before you left the house last night." He was practically hyperventilating, his entire wealthy world completely collapsing in real time right before his eyes. I listened quietly to his frantic, terrified breathing while looking around my dismal, cheap motel room. I thought about the long, agonizing months of extreme poverty and constant daily humiliation I had quietly endured just to reach this beautiful, satisfying moment. I thought about the terrible, unforgivable things my own family had casually said to me. I thought about the total, ruthless destruction of my marriage and my promising career at the hands of this pathetic, screaming man. I did not offer him a single word of explanation. I did not say a single comforting thing to ease his massive, escalating panic. I simply reached out with a steady hand and calmly ended the call. I tapped the glass screen one more time and permanently blocked his number from my phone forever. I gently closed my laptop and finally took a long, deep, refreshing breath of the stale motel air. The trap was completely sprung, and the federal agents were likely already moving in on his lavish corporate office. The final divorce court hearing was scheduled for exactly Monday morning. I smiled a genuine warm smile, knowing Terrence was about to walk into that formal courtroom as a totally, completely ruined man. The crisp Monday morning air felt entirely different as I stepped out of my temporary motel room for the very last time. The long, agonizing weekend was finally over, and the beautiful trap was officially set. I did not wear the cheap, faded clothes Terrence expected me to wear. I did not look like the destitute, broken woman my family desperately wanted me to be. I had spent a small portion of my newly acquired personal wealth on a completely flawless, custom-tailored white suit. The pristine white fabric draped perfectly over my shoulders and completely changed my entire posture. I had my locks intricately styled into a gorgeous, immaculate crown resting proudly on the top of my head. I looked exactly like absolute royalty, and I felt completely untouchable. I carried a simple, slim, black leather briefcase containing the absolute total destruction of every single person who had ever betrayed me. I walked up the massive marble steps of the federal courthouse with slow, deliberate power. The heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom swung open quietly as I stepped inside the echoing chamber. The large room was mostly empty except for the specific people who had gathered to eagerly watch my final public execution. I looked directly into the wooden gallery seating area. My mother Vivian sat perfectly straight in the front row, wearing her expensive pearls and a completely smug, expectant smile. Aaliyah sat right next to her, holding a designer handbag and whispering eagerly into my mother's ear. Paige was seated comfortably on the other side, wearing a light blue maternity dress and gently rubbing her slightly swollen stomach with a look of pure, absolute triumph on her pale face. They all turned their heads to glare at me as I walked down the center aisle. I saw their cruel, eager smiles instantly freeze and slowly melt into pure, genuine shock. They fully expected me to walk through those doors looking ragged, exhausted, and completely destroyed. Instead, I looked like a wealthy, powerful queen walking entirely unafraid into a battlefield. Terrence was already seated proudly at the large, polished mahogany defense table. He was wearing a dark custom Armani suit that cost more than most people made in an entire year. He sat with his broad shoulders thrown back, projecting total absolute arrogance to the entire room. I could see very faint dark circles under his eyes, revealing the massive panic he had undoubtedly suffered over the weekend when his offshore proxy mysteriously locked him out. But his unyielding, extreme arrogance convinced him it was simply a minor banking glitch that his wealth could easily fix. He genuinely believed he still held all the power in this room. Sitting right next to him was his incredibly expensive, high-powered white defense attorney. The older man looked exactly like a ruthless corporate shark, complete with a slick silver watch and a condescending sneer permanently painted across his deeply wrinkled face. I walked straight to the empty plaintiff table and sat down completely alone. I did not hire a lawyer. I did not need any legal counsel to translate the absolute undeniable truth I had resting securely inside my black leather briefcase. I was representing myself. The heavy wooden door behind the bench opened, and the judge finally entered the quiet room. She was a stern, older woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately took in the entire tense scene. She looked down at Terrence and his expensive legal shark, and then she looked over at me, sitting completely alone in my immaculate white suit. The formal legal proceedings began almost immediately. Terrence's high-priced attorney confidently stood up and smoothed the front of his expensive suit jacket. He addressed the judge with a smooth, polished voice that dripped with absolute arrogant condescension. He reached down and picked up a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He formally submitted a completely fraudulent financial affidavit to the court. He stood tall and boldly lied directly to the judge without a single ounce of hesitation or fear. Your Honor, my client has recently suffered a series of massive, devastating financial setbacks, the lawyer stated smoothly, pacing slowly in front of the heavy wooden defense table. His major commercial investments have completely failed due to sudden, unfortunate market shifts. He is currently drowning in severe, overwhelming debt. After a thorough and complete accounting of his personal and corporate finances, we have determined that the marital estate is essentially worth zero. The lawyer paused for dramatic effect, letting the massive lie echo through the large, quiet courtroom. Terrence looked down at the table, pretending to look completely devastated and deeply humbled by his totally fake financial ruin. The attorney then took a step closer to the judge's bench, raising his voice slightly to ensure everyone in the gallery heard his next cruel demand. Furthermore, Your Honor, given the fact that there are absolutely no assets to divide, we must immediately address the unacceptable behavior of the plaintiff. Ms. Imani has been acting in a deeply malicious and completely hysterical manner throughout this entire separation. She has routinely harassed my client and caused him immense emotional distress during his time of severe financial hardship. Because of her completely irrational behavior, we formally request that the court order Ms. Imani to pay my client's entire legal fees in full. A soft, satisfied gasp echoed from the wooden gallery behind me. Vivian and Paige were literally thrilled by the sheer, utter audacity of Terrence's brutal legal maneuver. They completely believed I was about to be entirely financially responsible for the very lawyer who was actively destroying my life. The stern judge slowly flipped through the thick stack of completely fabricated financial documents. Her expression remained completely neutral as she read through the massive, intricate lies Terrence and Carter had so carefully constructed to hide their massive wealth. The courtroom was absolutely dead silent, waiting for the final, crushing blow to fall. The judge slowly lowered the fraudulent documents and folded her hands together on the high wooden bench. She looked directly down at me, sitting completely alone at the plaintiff table. Ms. Imani, she said, her voice ringing clearly through the large, quiet room. You have chosen to appear today with absolutely no legal counsel to represent your interests. You have heard the statements made by the defense. How exactly do you respond to the formal claim that the marital assets are completely zero? I did not panic. I did not cry. I looked back at Terrence, who was staring at me with a completely victorious, evil smirk. I simply smiled a bright, beautiful, warm smile and slowly reached down to click open the metal latches of my black leather briefcase, ready to show them all exactly who controlled the narrative and who truly owned the absolute ultimate power. The massive mahogany courtroom doors had long since swung shut, sealing everyone inside for the final reckoning. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, listening to the heavy silence that fell over the room after Terrence's high-priced defense attorney finished his ridiculous fabricated speech. The lawyer had spoken with such smooth, practiced arrogance, spinning a tale of absolute financial ruin and severe debt. He had painted Terrence as a tragic victim of shifting economic markets, claiming that the marital estate was completely depleted. He had the absolute audacity to stand before the judge and demand that I pay his exorbitant legal fees simply because I had the nerve to exist and demand my fair share. I did not object. I did not argue. I did not let a single emotion cross my face as the lawyer sat back down next to Terrence. Terrence leaned back in his expensive leather chair, adjusting the cuffs of his custom Armani suit with a smug, satisfied smirk. He genuinely believed he had won. He thought his expensive white-collar defense attorney had successfully bullied the court into submission. Behind him, in the wooden gallery seating, I could feel the burning glares of my mother Vivian and my sister Aelia. They were sitting right next to Paige, who was shifting uncomfortably in her expensive maternity dress, rubbing her stomach and looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. They were all waiting for me to break down. They were waiting for the tears and the desperate pleading that usually accompanied a devastating legal defeat. Judge Harrison looked down at me from his elevated bench. His expression was entirely unreadable. A mask of professional neutrality carved from years of presiding over bitter, high-stakes divorces. He adjusted his silver-framed reading glasses and folded his hands over the stack of fraudulent financial affidavits the defense had just submitted. "Mrs. Imani," he said, his deep voice echoing across the quiet room, "you have no legal counsel present today. You are representing yourself in a highly complex asset division case. How do you respond to the specific claim from the defense that the marital assets are completely zero and that you should be held financially responsible for their legal fees?" I looked back at the judge. A slow, steady smile began to form on my lips. It was not a smile of defeat or desperation, but one of absolute terrifying certainty. I did not say a single word at first. I simply reached down to the floor beside my chair and lifted my slim black leather briefcase onto the polished wooden table. The sharp metallic click of the brass latches echoing through the silent courtroom sounded like the cocking of a loaded weapon. Terrence's smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. His lawyer narrowed his eyes, watching my every movement with sudden creeping suspicion. I opened the briefcase and bypassed the standard stacks of legal briefs and printed emails. Instead, I reached into the very back compartment and pulled out a single thick, heavily reinforced manila envelope. It was not a standard legal document. It was bound with thick red tamper-evident tape and stamped boldly with the unmistakable official seal of the United States Department of Justice. The heavy parchment felt incredibly solid in my hands, carrying the absolute weight of their complete destruction. I stood up from the table. My tailored white suit moved flawlessly as I stepped out from behind the heavy wooden desk. The pristine white fabric stood in stark, sharp contrast to the dark, gloomy lies Terrence had just tried to sell to the court. I walked slowly and deliberately across the open floor directly toward the judge's bench. The sound of my heels clicking against the polished marble floor was the only noise in the entire room. I could feel the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The arrogant confidence radiating from the defense table was rapidly evaporating, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. I stopped directly in front of the elevated bench and held out the heavy sealed envelope. I did not argue with the fabricated claims Terrence had made. I did not need to defend myself against his pathetic lies. "I submit Exhibit A, Your Honor," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. "Straight from the Department of Justice." The bailiff stepped forward and took the thick envelope from my hands, passing it up to Judge Harrison. The judge looked at the heavy red federal seals. His thick gray eyebrows rose slightly in surprise. He picked up a silver letter opener and sliced through the thick tamper-evident tape. The sharp ripping sound caused Terrence to visibly flinch in his seat. The judge pulled out a thick stack of official federal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He adjusted his glasses and began to read the first page. The entire courtroom held its collective breath. The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and oppressive. Terrence leaned forward in his chair, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the defense table. His expensive lawyer was no longer slouching with arrogant confidence. He was sitting bolt upright, staring at the documents in the judge's hands with absolute raw panic. In the gallery behind them, Paige stopped rubbing her stomach and sat perfectly rigid. Vivian and Elia exchanged nervous, terrified glances. Judge Harrison continued to read. His eyes tracked back and forth across the dense legal text. Suddenly, his professional neutral expression cracked. The corners of his mouth began to twitch upward. A low rumbling sound started deep in his chest. Within seconds, the stern, highly respected judge burst into loud, echoing laughter. It was a genuine, spontaneous laugh of pure, absolute amusement that completely shattered the tense, formal decorum of the courtroom. He leaned back in his high leather chair, shaking his head in disbelief as the booming sound filled the room. "Oh, this is good," the judge finally managed to say, wiping a small tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. "This is very good." Terrence and his lawyer looked completely confused and entirely terrified. The lawyer's face had drained of all color, matching the pristine white shade of my suit. Paige shifted violently in her seat, her previous look of triumph entirely replaced by blind, sheer terror. They had no idea what was happening, but they knew with absolute certainty that the ground had just completely collapsed beneath their feet. The judge cleared his throat, tapping the thick stack of papers against his desk to regain his composure. He looked directly down at Terrence, and the amusement in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, piercing judicial glare. He picked up the first page of the federal document and held it up for the entire room to see. "This is an official Internal Revenue Service notification." Judge Harrison read aloud, his voice carrying the heavy, absolute weight of federal law. Mr. Terrence attempted to dissipate $400,000 of marital funds into a secure offshore shell company. The judge paused, letting the massive reality of the federal wire fraud hang heavily in the silent air. He looked right over the top rim of his silver glasses, staring directly into Terrence's wide, terrified eyes. "However, it appears, you put the shell company in the name of your deceased father-in-law, a man whose estate is solely, completely, and legally controlled by your wife." The absolute heavy silence that crashed down on the courtroom after the judge's words was completely deafening. The air in the massive mahogany room grew incredibly thin and suffocating. Terrence stared up at the elevated bench with a totally blank, uncomprehending expression on his handsome face. His brain was entirely unable to process the massive, fatal error he had just committed. He had genuinely believed that using my deceased father's identity to register an illegal offshore shell company was the perfect, untraceable crime. His absolute towering arrogance had completely blinded him to the basic legal reality that as my father's only living heir, I was the sole legal executor of his entire estate. He had essentially built a massive, impenetrable digital vault to hide his stolen wealth, and then willingly handed the only existing key directly to me. I stood tall behind the plaintiff table, my white tailored suit making me feel like a pristine avenging angel in a room full of dark, filthy lies. I did not let a single ounce of gloating show on my face. I simply looked up at the judge with pure professional calm. I took a slow, steady breath and let my voice ring out clearly across the silent room, ensuring every single person present heard my exact words. "Under the strict provisions of the Dissipation of Marital Assets Law, Your Honor," I said smoothly, projecting my voice with absolute confident authority. "Because my husband intentionally and maliciously attempted to hide these specific funds in a direct, deliberate effort to defraud both this legal court and myself during an active divorce proceeding, I am legally entitled to a full and complete recovery." He did not simply make a poor business investment. He purposefully funneled highly illegal, untraceable black money through my dead father's name to completely hide it from the legal division of our marital estate. Because of this extreme documented financial malice, I am formally requesting that the court award me 100% of those recovered funds. The highly paid white-collar defense attorney sitting next to Terrence suddenly looked like he was going to be physically sick. All the smooth, arrogant condescension completely vanished from his deeply wrinkled face in a fraction of a second. He was a seasoned legal shark who suddenly realized he was swimming in a pool of his own blood. He knew exactly what the heavy red federal seals on those documents meant. Submitting a completely fraudulent financial affidavit to a sitting judge was an incredibly serious crime that could easily cost him his entire legal career and his license to practice law. He began to scramble frantically in his heavy leather chair. He leaned over, grabbing Terrence's arm and pulling him close. He was whispering furiously into Terrence's ear, his face slick with a sudden cold, terrified sweat. He was desperately trying to do immediate damage control, begging his client to remain completely silent before they both ended up in a federal prison cell. But Terrence's massive, fragile ego simply could not handle the total absolute humiliation of being completely outsmarted by the woman he had treated like a worthless, invisible servant. He could not accept that his brilliant criminal masterpiece had been so effortlessly dismantled by someone he considered entirely beneath him. The panic radiating from his lawyer only fueled his sudden, explosive, unhinged rage. He violently ripped his arm out of his lawyer's desperate, grasping grip. He stood up so quickly that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the polished marble floor. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at me, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. "That is a complete lie!" he shouted, his voice echoing wildly off the high, vaulted ceilings of the formal courtroom. He completely ignored his lawyer, who had buried his face in his hands in absolute, total despair. "I have $15 million sitting safely in that specific offshore account," Terrence screamed at the top of his lungs, his chest heaving with pure, uncontrolled panic and rage. "It is my money. I earned every single penny of it. She cannot just take it away from me." A collective shocked gasp erupted from the wooden gallery behind me. I did not even turn my head to look, but I could easily picture Vivian clutching her expensive pearls in absolute sheer horror. I knew Paige was shifting uncomfortably in her seat, finally realizing that the wealthy, glamorous lifestyle she had stolen from me was entirely built on a massive, crumbling foundation of federal wire fraud. By losing his temper and shouting those specific words in an open court, Terrence had just completely destroyed his own entire life. The sharp, deafening crack of a heavy wooden gavel echoed through the room like a sudden gunshot. Judge Harrison struck the sounding block with incredible violent force, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. The judge leaned forward over the high bench, staring down at Terrence with eyes that looked like cold, hard steel. "Mr. Terrence," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of any amusement, now replaced by a dark, dangerous anger. "You just stood in my courtroom and explicitly admitted to committing severe perjury on an official sworn financial affidavit. You submitted formal legal documents to this court just 10 minutes ago, claiming under penalty of perjury that your marital estate was completely empty and your assets were entirely zero. You just loudly confessed on the official court record that you are currently hiding $15 million in a secret offshore bank account." Terrence suddenly froze, his mouth still slightly open, as the absolute catastrophic reality of his own stupid words finally crashed down upon him. He looked down at his expensive lawyer, who was simply shaking his head slowly back and forth, completely paralyzed by his client's fatal, unforced error. Terrence looked around the room, his arrogant posture entirely collapsing as he realized he had just willingly confessed to massive federal fraud right in front of a sitting judge. He was breathing heavily, looking like a trapped, cornered animal who finally understood there was absolutely no way out of the cage. I remained perfectly still, my face a portrait of total, peaceful serenity. I looked up at the angry judge and decided it was finally time to deliver the absolute final crushing blow to Terrence's miserable, pathetic existence. I let a small, soft smile touch the corners of my lips. "Your Honor," I said quietly, my calm, steady voice easily piercing the thick, heavy tension in the terrified courtroom. "He does not actually have $15 million in that account." I paused for a brief second, watching Terrence's eyes widen in fresh new confusion and absolute raw terror. Please turn to page 2 of the federal document. The absolute heavy silence in the courtroom somehow deepened, becoming incredibly dense and entirely suffocating. Terrence sat perfectly frozen at the defense table, his mouth still slightly open as the catastrophic reality of the judge's words slowly settled over him. He had completely believed he was an untouchable financial genius. He had truly thought he could easily outsmart the federal government, the divorce court, and the quiet, observant woman he had treated like a worthless maid. But he had just learned that his brilliant offshore shell company, the very foundation of his hidden wealth, was legally registered under my deceased father's name, making me the sole absolute legal executor of the entire account. His high-priced white-collar defense attorney simply closed his eyes and slowly lowered his head into his trembling hands, completely surrendering to the absolute devastating legal reality. I did not say a single word. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff table, my pristine white tailored suit radiating absolute pure power and total flawless victory. I looked up at the judge, my face remaining a mask of perfectly calm, serene composure. Under the strict provisions of the Dissipation of Marital Assets Law. Your Honor, I said smoothly, projecting my voice with absolute confident authority. Because my husband intentionally and maliciously attempted to hide these specific funds in a direct, deliberate effort to defraud both this legal court and myself during an active divorce proceeding, I am legally entitled to a full and complete recovery of those hidden assets. He did not simply make a poor business investment, as his attorney just falsely claimed. He purposefully funneled highly illegal, untraceable black money through my dead father's name to completely hide it from the legal division of our marital estate. Because of this extreme documented financial malice, I am formally requesting that the court award me 100% of those recovered funds. The highly paid defense attorney sitting next to Terrence suddenly looked like he was going to be physically sick. He began to scramble frantically in his heavy leather chair, leaning over and grabbing Terrence's arm. He was whispering furiously into Terrence's ear, his face slick with a sudden cold, terrified sweat. He was desperately trying to do immediate damage control, begging his client to remain completely silent before they both ended up in a federal prison cell. But Terrence's massive, fragile ego simply could not handle the total, absolute humiliation of being completely outsmarted. The panic radiating from his lawyer only fueled his sudden, explosive, unhinged rage. He violently ripped his arm out of his lawyer's desperate, grasping grip. He stood up so quickly that his heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the polished marble floor. "That is a complete lie," Terrence shouted, his voice echoing wildly off the high vaulted ceilings of the formal courtroom. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at me, his face turning a dark, violent shade of purple. "I have $15 million sitting safely in that specific offshore account," Terrence screamed at the top of his lungs, his chest heaving with pure, uncontrolled panic and rage. "It is my money. I earned every single penny of it. She cannot just take it away from me." By losing his temper and shouting those specific careless words in an open court, Terrence had just completely destroyed his own entire life. He had made the absolute ultimate fatal error. The sharp, deafening crack of a heavy wooden gavel echoed through the room like a sudden gunshot. Judge Harrison struck the sounding block with incredible violent force, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. The judge leaned forward over the high bench, staring down at Terrence with eyes that looked like cold, hard steel. "Mr. Terrence," the judge said, his voice completely devoid of any amusement, now replaced by a dark, dangerous anger. "You just stood in my courtroom and explicitly admitted to committing severe perjury on an official sworn financial affidavit. You submitted formal legal documents to this court just minutes ago, claiming under penalty of perjury that your marital estate was completely empty and your assets were entirely zero. You just loudly confessed on the official court record that you are currently hiding $15 million in a secret offshore bank account." Terrence suddenly froze, his mouth still slightly open as the absolute catastrophic reality of his own stupid words finally crashed down upon him. He looked down at his expensive lawyer, who was simply shaking his head slowly back and forth, completely paralyzed by his clients. Fatal unforced error. Terrence looked around the room, his arrogant posture entirely collapsing as he realized he had just willingly confessed to massive federal fraud right in front of a sitting judge. But I was not completely finished with him yet. The final nail in his lavish coffin had not yet been driven home. "Your Honor," I said quietly, my calm, steady voice easily piercing the thick, heavy tension in the terrified courtroom. "He does not actually have $15 million in that account." I paused for a brief second, watching Terrence's eyes widen in fresh new confusion and absolute raw terror. "Please turn to page 2 of the federal document." Judge Harrison did not pause. His stern eyes scanned down the thick, heavy federal document, turning to the second page of the pristine, watermarked paper. The quiet, rustling sound of the turning page echoed loudly through the completely silent room. The judge adjusted his silver-framed reading glasses and looked directly down at Terrence. "It explicitly states here on the second page of this official federal decree," Judge Harrison continued, his deep voice carrying the absolute final weight of the United States Department of Justice, "that Ms. Imani acted as an official fully authorized federal whistleblower. She worked in direct, careful coordination with federal agents, systematically exposing a massive $35 million international money laundering ring operated entirely by Terrence and Carter." The judge paused, letting the incredible massive number completely fill the large mahogany courtroom. $35 million. The entire room seemed to completely stop breathing. Terrence's handsome, arrogant face completely crumbled. His elaborate web of deceit had not just been untangled, it had been completely weaponized against him by the very woman he had systematically abused and discarded. I had spent 5 long, agonizing months quietly enduring their relentless, cruel insults while secretly planting deep digital tracking software, routing their corrupt financial transactions directly to the highest levels of the federal government. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, bringing the focus back to the heavy federal document. As per strict federal law regarding extreme financial compliance and official whistleblower compensation, the judge read aloud, his voice echoing with undeniable legal finality. "Miss Imani has been formally awarded 30% of the completely recovered $35 million federal funds." The judge slowly took off his silver reading glasses and looked directly back at Terrence, delivering the absolute final crushing blow. "The Department of Justice has mandated that the $10.5 million federal bounty awarded to your wife is to be distributed immediately and completely tax-free." A sudden loud dramatic gasp violently ripped through the wooden gallery behind me. Vivian had completely lost her rigid high society composure. She was clutching her expensive pearl necklace so hard the delicate string looked like it might suddenly snap. The heavy realization hit her like a massive speeding freight train. Her entire lavish, arrogant lifestyle, funded entirely by her husband's dirty, corrupt money, was completely over. Ayalea let out a high-pitched, terrified whimper and desperately grabbed her father Carter's arm. Her perfectly manicured fingers dug deeply into his expensive suit jacket. But Carter could not offer her any salvation. His face had gone completely chalk white, draining of all its arrogant, entitled color. His skin looked clammy and sickly pale, covered in a sudden thick layer of cold, terrified sweat. His massive commercial real estate empire, his pristine reputation, his entire wealthy identity had just been completely obliterated in a matter of seconds. He knew exactly what a sweeping $35 million federal indictment meant. It meant spending the rest of his natural life rotting inside a cold, concrete federal prison cell. Paige was sitting completely paralyzed in the row directly behind Terrence. Her pale face was frozen in a mask of absolute pure horror. Her heavy, expensive designer handbag slipped from her trembling, clammy fingers and crashed loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. The thick gold clasp snapped open violently, spilling her expensive makeup, her luxury car keys, and her useless platinum credit cards everywhere. She did not even blink. She did not look down at the mess. She just sat there staring blankly at Terrence's shaking back, finally realizing the absolute devastating truth. The incredibly wealthy, successful man she had deliberately stolen from me was actually a massive federal criminal who was about to lose absolutely everything. She had traded her entire life to bind herself to a man who was heading straight to a federal penitentiary, leaving her completely destitute and entirely alone with a new baby. Total, absolute panic completely overtook the gallery. Carter simply could not handle the crushing, suffocating reality of his total, absolute destruction. His legendary massive ego fractured completely under the heavy, crushing weight of his impending federal arrest. He slowly stood up from the hard wooden bench, his knees visibly shaking under the fine, expensive fabric of his tailored trousers. He deliberately ignored his terrified daughter, Aliyah, and his completely panicked wife, Vivian. In his moment of absolute sheer desperation, his only instinct was pure pathetic self-preservation. He abandoned his family without a single second thought. Carter began to quickly shuffle his way toward the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the massive courtroom. He kept his head down, trying desperately not to draw any attention to his cowardly, pathetic retreat. He just wanted to escape the suffocating, tense room and disappear into the city before the absolute final heavy hammer of justice officially fell on his head. He reached out his shaking, sweating hand to grab the thick, heavy brass handle of the courtroom door, hoping to slip quietly out into the hallway and run away from his completely ruined life. But just as his trembling fingers brushed against the cold, solid metal, the massive, heavy wooden doors were suddenly and violently pushed open from the outside. The heavy, solid oak doors of the courtroom did not just open, they violently exploded inward with a massive, terrifying force. Carter had barely wrapped his trembling, sweaty fingers around the brass handle when the heavy wood slammed backward, hitting his shoulder and sending his tall, aristocratic frame stumbling awkwardly back into the gallery rows. He collided heavily with the edge of a wooden bench, his immaculate suit jacket catching on the carved armrest as he desperately tried to maintain his balance. Out of the bright hallway, shadows stepped 6 heavily armed federal agents. They moved with swift, terrifying military precision. Their dark navy blue windbreakers were emblazoned with the bright, bold yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Their heavy tactical boots thudded loudly against the polished marble floor, echoing through the massive vaulted chamber like a steady, relentless drumbeat of absolute doom. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table, my hands neatly folded in my lap, watching the beautiful chaos unfold exactly as I had planned. The agents did not even look in my direction. They completely bypassed my table, treating me as exactly what I was, an untouchable federal asset and a protected whistleblower. They fanned out across the large room, completely surrounding the defense table and sealing off every possible exit from the gallery. The air in the courtroom instantly grew incredibly thin and suffocating. Terrence was still standing behind his expensive polished desk, completely frozen in place from his earlier outburst. His handsome face was entirely slack, his mouth hanging open as he stared at the federal agents closing in around him. His high-priced defense attorney took one look at the FBI agents and immediately stepped backward, raising both of his hands in the air, signaling his complete surrender and distancing himself from his radioactive client. The lawyer knew his career was hanging by a single fragile thread, and he was not about to go down with a sinking ship. 2 large federal agents grabbed Terrence by his broad shoulders. The absolute physical reality of the moment finally broke through his state of shock, and he let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. They spun him around, roughly shoving him hard against the heavy mahogany paneling of the courtroom wall. The beautiful custom Armani suit that he had worn to completely intimidate me crumpled and twisted uselessly against the hard wood. The sharp, unmistakable metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs echoed through the dead-silent room as the agents forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back and locked his wrists together. Terrence began to violently hyperventilate his chest, heaving up and down in rapid, shallow gasps. thick beads of cold sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes as his entire world completely collapsed into absolute total ruin. Meanwhile, in the back of the courtroom, two other highly trained agents had already closed the distance on Carter. He was still trying to recover his footing from being knocked backward by the door, but the agents gave him absolutely no time to react. They grabbed him by the arms of his expensive tailored suit, twisting him around just as forcefully as they had done to his son-in-law. Carter, the untouchable real estate mogul. The man who had looked down on me my entire life was violently shoved face first against the back wall of the gallery. His gray hair was suddenly disheveled, his face pressed awkwardly against the smooth wood as cold steel cuffs were slapped tightly onto his wrists. The lead FBI agent stepped forward to the center of the room, his voice booming with absolute unyielding federal authority. "Carter and Terrence, you are both currently under arrest for massive coordinated wire fraud, severe tax evasion, and an extensive ongoing conspiracy to commit international money laundering." The reading of the formal federal charges acted like a massive bomb going off in the middle of the gallery. The illusion of their wealthy elite untouchable status evaporated instantly into nothing but smoke and ashes. Carter completely lost his aristocratic mind. His legendary composure shattered into a million sharp, pathetic pieces. He began to scream wildly, twisting his neck to look over his shoulder at his terrified family. "Call the lawyers!" He roared, his voice cracking in absolute raw panic. "Aaliyah, call the firm right now. Get them down here immediately. Do not just sit there. Call them." Aaliyah was sitting frozen in the front row, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face, completely paralyzed by the sight of her powerful, wealthy husband being treated like a common street criminal. Vivian was slumped against the wooden bench, her eyes wide and glassy, completely unable to process the absolute devastation of her entire social empire. They had spent their entire lives treating me like garbage because I did not fit their elite background, and now they were watching their entire legacy be destroyed by a single quiet woman in a tailored white suit. The agents pulled Terrence away from the wall, forcefully turning him around to face the courtroom. He looked absolutely pathetic. His expensive tie was skewed, his custom shirt was wrinkled and pulled tight across his chest, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting frantically around the room, looking for anyone who could possibly save him. He was struggling so hard to breathe that one of the agents had to grip his elbow tightly just to keep him from physically collapsing onto the floor. His massive, fragile ego had been completely shattered, leaving nothing behind but a weak, terrified little boy who had finally been caught playing a very dangerous game. Suddenly, the quiet, terrified sobbing in the gallery turned into a loud, desperate wail. Paige, who had been sitting frozen in horror, finally snapped out of her state of shock. She scrambled out of her seat, nearly tripping over her own expensive heels. She rushed down the center aisle, completely ignoring the federal agents as she threw herself against the low wooden barricade that separated the gallery from the main courtroom floor. She gripped the polished wooden rail so tightly her knuckles turned bright white tears, completely ruining her expensive, flawless makeup. "Terrence!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing with absolute blind desperation. "What is happening, Terrence? What about the baby? What about my luxury condo?" The sheer selfish absurdity of her questions in the middle of a massive federal takedown almost made me laugh out loud. She was watching the man she stole from me being hauled away to a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life, and her only concern was her expensive real estate and her stolen lifestyle. The heavy, chaotic noise inside the courtroom was absolutely deafening as the federal agents secured the perimeter, but Judge Harrison remained a towering figure of absolute calm authority on his elevated bench. The judge slowly lowered his silver-framed reading glasses and looked directly down at Paige, who was still frantically clinging to the low wooden barricade. Her shrill, demanding screams about her luxury condo and her lavish lifestyle echoed obnoxiously through the room until the judge finally decided to put a complete and absolute end to her pathetic delusions. "Mom," Judge Harrison said, his deep, booming voice easily cutting through the panicked shouting of the federal raid. I highly suggest you release that railing and listen very carefully to the stark reality of your current situation. The luxury condominium you are screaming about is no longer legally accessible to you or to the man currently in federal custody. The judge leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the thick stack of fraudulent legal documents Terrence had tried to submit just minutes prior. Mr. Terrence's entire financial portfolio, his hidden offshore accounts, his corporate holdings, and all of his luxury real estate properties have been officially and permanently seized by the federal government of the United States, the judge stated with absolute cold finality. Furthermore, due to his documented malicious attempts to intentionally defraud this court and hide his illicit wealth, I have officially ruled that the entirety of the remaining marital assets be awarded 100% to his wife, Mrs. Imani. The judge paused, letting the devastating truth completely wash over the hysterical pregnant woman. Your lover has absolutely nothing left. The judge continued, his tone unyielding. He is effectively millions of dollars in severe crushing debt, and he is facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The transformation that occurred on Paige's face was absolutely chilling to witness. The hysterical fake tears that had been streaming down her pale cheeks stopped instantly, drying up the very second she realized the endless river of stolen money had permanently run dry. The desperate, panicked pregnant woman routine completely evaporated into thin air, replaced by a cold, hard, calculating mask of pure, selfish preservation. She slowly let go of the polished wooden barricade, her hands dropping to her sides. She did not look at the FBI agents swarming the room. She did not look at the stern judge on the bench. She turned her sharp, piercing gaze directly onto Terrence, who was still breathing heavily against the mahogany wall with his hands firmly shackled behind his back. Terrence looked back at her with wide, terrified, pleading eyes. His custom Armani suit was completely crumpled and ruined, his chest heaving with pure, uncontrolled panic. He was desperately hoping for a single ounce of loyalty or comfort from the woman he had completely destroyed his marriage and his entire life to protect. He thought she would stand by him. Instead, Paige just stared at his pathetic, helpless posture with absolute unadulterated disgust, twisting her features. "You're broke," she stated, her voice completely flat and dripping with pure toxic venom. She did not wait for him to try and formulate an answer. She did not shed a single tear for his impending prison sentence or his total financial ruin. Paige simply turned on her expensive designer heel and began to walk away. She walked straight up the center aisle of the gallery, completely ignoring the absolute chaos erupting all around her. She walked directly past her own brother Carter, who was currently being aggressively searched by two heavy-set federal agents near the back pews. Carter looked up with a pale, sweaty face and called out her name, his voice cracking with pure, raw desperation, begging his own sister for help, or at least a final look of sympathy. But Paige did not even flinch. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead and walked completely out of the heavy mahogany courtroom doors, leaving her disgraced brother and her entirely ruined lover behind, without a single backward glance. Terrence physically slumped against the wall as the heavy wooden doors clicked shut behind the mistress he had sacrificed everything for. The absolute crushing realization finally hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. He had thrown away a fiercely loyal wife, a beautiful home, and a peaceful life for a greedy, superficial woman who did not even care enough to say goodbye the very second his corrupt bank accounts ran dry. He had absolutely nothing to his name except empty promises crushing federal debt and cold steel cuffs. But the pure, absolute chaos in the courtroom was far from over. Down in the front row of the gallery, my mother Vivian had finally snapped out of her paralyzed state of shock. She was watching her golden child Aelia, weeping uncontrollably on the wooden bench as the federal agents prepared to haul Carter away to a temporary holding cell. In Vivian's twisted, superficial mind, Carter was not a massive federal criminal who had systematically stolen millions of dollars and laundered it through illegal shell companies. He was simply her wealthy son-in-law, the man who funded her exclusive country club memberships and maintained her elite high society status. Her shallow brain simply could not process the fact that her pristine social empire was currently burning to the ground right in front of her eyes. Vivian frantically scrambled out of the wooden gallery bench, completely ignoring Terrence, who was still hyperventilating against the wall just a few feet away. She pushed her way past the federal agents who were busy securing the perimeter of the room. She rushed desperately toward the plaintiff's table, where I was still standing perfectly still in my immaculate tailored white suit. Her expensive pearls clattered loudly against her chest, and her carefully styled hair was practically coming undone as she quickly closed the distance between us. "Imani!" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure raw panic and absolute blind entitlement. "You have to fix this right now. You have to tell them it is all a huge misunderstanding." Vivian reached out and desperately grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging tightly into the pristine white fabric of my custom suit jacket. She pulled on my sleeve, trying to force me to look at the pathetic weeping mess that was my sister Aaliyah sitting in the gallery. "You cannot do this to your own family!" Vivian cried out hysterically, completely ignoring the massive, undeniable fact that I had just been awarded a massive federal bounty for exposing a massive criminal syndicate. "Carter is the absolute pillar of our family," Vivian pleaded, her eyes wide and frantic. "He takes care of us. He provides for us. You cannot just let them take your sister's husband away like a common street criminal. You have to make them stop." I looked down at my mother's hand, desperately gripping my pristine white jacket. For 35 long, agonizing years, I had let this specific woman dictate my entire self-worth. I had let her make me feel small, invisible, and entirely unworthy of love simply because I did not fit perfectly into her shallow, materialistic world. She had always chosen Aaliyah over me, and now she was demanding that I sacrifice my own hard-won justice just to save the criminal who funded their pathetic, lavish lifestyle. I looked back up into her panicked, tear-stained eyes. Her expression was full of frantic, breathless expectation, fully believing that I would simply bow my head, fall into line, and magically erase the consequences of their horrible actions. The entire courtroom, including the armed federal agents, the stern judge, and the terrified, shackled prisoners, suddenly seemed to hold its collective breath, watching this intense, deeply personal confrontation unfold. I did not shout at her. I did not scream or lose my composure. I simply reached over with absolute, slow, deliberate precision and firmly grasped my mother's wrist. I stared directly into her shocked eyes as I slowly and powerfully peeled her clutching fingers off of my crisp white suit jacket, completely removing her desperate, toxic hold on me. The entire dynamic of our relationship violently and permanently shifted in that single silent motion. My mother stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. But before she could formulate another ridiculous demand, my sister Aaliyah suddenly rushed forward. She threw herself out of the gallery bench and practically ran up to the plaintiff's table, tears violently streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Her expensive designer dress was twisted, and her normally perfect hair was flying wildly around her shoulders. "How could you do this to us?" Aaliyah screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure hysterical rage. "You are a monster, Imani! You just destroyed our entire family!" She pointed a shaking manicured finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the heavily armed federal agents who were systematically securing the room and reading Carter his Miranda rights. "You are just jealous," she shrieked, her face turning an ugly, blotchy shade of red. "You have always been so bitterly jealous of me because my husband is white and wealthy and powerful, and yours was just a pathetic loser who cheated on you. You could not stand seeing me happy?" Aaliyah continued to scream, her chest heaving with desperate, panicked breaths, her voice echoing harshly against the high vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. "You could not stand the fact that Carter gave me the perfect life, the massive mansion, the exclusive country club memberships, the luxury cars, the private jets. You had to ruin it all because you are miserable and alone, and you want everyone else to be exactly as miserable as you are." The absolute sheer delusion radiating from her was almost breathtaking. She was watching her husband being physically processed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and her only instinct was to try and make me feel small again, to use the exact same toxic high society playbook our mother had taught her since we were little girls. She truly believed that if she screamed loud enough and threw my failed marriage in my face, I would simply crumble and back down, just like I always did in the past. But I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not lower my eyes. Instead, I stepped directly into Aelia's personal space, closing the distance between us, until she was forced to physically tilt her head back just to look me in the eye. The sudden, sheer, absolute authority radiating from my posture made her completely freeze mid-scream. Her mouth hung open and her shaking fingers slowly dropped to her side as she looked up at the cold, unfeeling expression on my face. "Your husband is a massive federal felon," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper that easily carried across the entire dead-silent courtroom, cutting through the heavy tension like a sharpened blade. "Your perfect wealthy white husband, explicitly and maliciously, used our dead black father's stolen identity to commit massive international crimes." I took another slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Alia to stumble backward against the heavy wooden barricade. "He funneled highly illegal, untraceable black money through a dead man's name to completely hide his fraudulent empire. And you just smiled and posed for society photos while he did it. You let him disrespect the only man who ever truly loved us, just so you could keep buying your designer handbags and pretending you were better than everyone else." Aaliyah's mouth dropped open in absolute stunned horror, but I did not give her a single second to recover or formulate a pathetic defense. "You spent your entire life looking down on me, looking down on our father's legacy, just because you wanted to play the role of the perfect elite high society wife," I continued, my voice completely void of any sisterly affection. "You traded your own flesh and blood for blood money and country club invitations. But let me make one thing absolutely perfectly clear to you right now, in front of this judge and these federal agents," I said, my voice dripping with absolute pure icy venom. "Your wealth is completely fake. It is nothing but dirty stolen paper built on a massive federal lie. My wealth is completely federal. My wealth is legally mandated by the United States Department of Justice, and it is sitting cleanly and safely in my completely untouchable bank accounts." Aaliyah started to physically shake her knees violently, wobbling under the fine fabric of her dress. She looked frantically over at Carter, who was now sitting slumped on a wooden bench, heavily guarded by two armed agents, his head buried in his handcuffed hands, completely unable to look at her or offer her any salvation. He was completely defeated and broken, and Aaliyah was suddenly realizing that she was entirely alone in a massive burning house. "Since you love your lavish fake lifestyle so much, I think you should probably know what is going to happen next," I said, tilting my head slightly and looking at her with absolute cold detachment. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not just arrest the criminals, Aaliyah. They completely dismantle their entire fraudulent infrastructure. The massive multi-million-dollar luxury mansion that you love so much, the one you constantly threw in my face every single Thanksgiving, that house was purchased entirely with highly illegal laundered funds." The realization hit her like a physical, massive blow to the stomach. She let out a tiny, pathetic gasp, raising both of her trembling hands to cover her mouth, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated terror. "That is right, Aaliyah," I said, offering her a chilling, completely unsympathetic smile. "The FBI is currently seizing your pristine luxury estate right this very second. The federal agents are currently boxing up your expensive designer clothes, seizing your luxury vehicles, freezing your bank accounts, and completely shutting down every single one of your high-limit credit cards. You have absolutely zero assets. You have zero money. Your entire identity has been completely erased by the federal government. You are about to be completely and totally homeless, Aaliyah." I let the absolute devastating weight of those final words completely crush her remaining arrogant spirit. "Maybe Mom can let you serve the turkey next year, since you will be living in her guest bedroom, relying entirely on her rapidly shrinking charity because Carter is never coming back." The sound that came out of my sister was not human. It was a deep, guttural wail of pure, absolute, total defeat. Her legs finally gave out completely, and she collapsed onto the hard hardwood floor, weeping hysterically into her shaking hands as the absolute reality of her complete financial and social annihilation finally set in. She was nothing now, just the broke wife of a convicted federal fraudster facing a lifetime of complete public humiliation. And then the final, absolute, total collapse of the family hierarchy occurred right in front of my eyes. Vivian, who had been standing frozen just a few feet away, watching her two golden children completely destroyed, finally processed the absolute sheer magnitude of the situation. Her beautiful, untouchable high society world had been completely incinerated into nothing but dust and ashes. The exclusive country club memberships, the lavish charity galas, the elite status. It was all entirely gone forever, replaced by massive federal indictments and total public disgrace. Vivian let out a loud, dramatic sob, and her knees visibly buckled beneath her expensive tailored skirt. She dropped heavily to the polished marble floor, landing directly on her knees right in front of me. The incredibly proud, arrogant woman who had spent 35 agonizing years making me feel like an unwanted, worthless outsider was now kneeling on the floor of a federal courtroom, genuinely sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect makeup completely ruined by a flood of terrified tears. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands, grasping at the air around my knees as she completely abandoned her massive ego and begged me for absolute mercy, realizing I was the only one holding the keys to the entire kingdom. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping woman kneeling on the cold marble floor right at my feet. My mother Vivian was entirely stripped of her haughty, elitist arrogance, her expensive designer skirt bunching awkwardly and uncomfortably around her knees as she stared up at me with terrified, desperate, pleading eyes. She was waiting for me to comfort her, to immediately slip back into my lifelong assigned role as the dutiful, invisible daughter who always absorbed all of her toxic shame and fixed all of her terrible mistakes. She truly believed that my fierce loyalty to blood would override the decades of constant psychological abuse. But that specific daughter was completely dead and permanently buried. I stared at her trembling, manicured hands clutching at the empty air, and then I looked directly into her running, mascara-stained eyes. "You never actually loved me?" I said, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any lingering familial warmth. The words echoed clearly and sharply through the massive, quiet space where even the heavily armed federal agents had paused their movements to watch the devastating personal confrontation unfold. "You hated everything about me from the very moment I was born. You hated my dark skin. You hated my thick, coarse hair. You hated the undeniable, absolute fact that I looked exactly like my brilliant, hardworking black father." The raw, unfiltered truth of my words hit her like a massive physical blow, causing her to violently flinch and sob even louder. "You spent your entire life trying to completely erase him and everything he proudly stood for." I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, so my shadow completely enveloped her, kneeling, shaking form. "You worshipped people like Carter and Terrence. You blindly worshipped the exact same elite people who constantly put me down, who openly sneered at my humble background, who treated me like absolute disposable garbage simply because they gave you a pathetic little taste of their white privilege. You gladly traded your own flesh and blood for exclusive restricted country club memberships and coveted invitations to fancy high society charity galas, where they only ever saw you as an entertaining token anyway." Vivian shook her head frantically back and forth, her carefully styled, expensive hair completely falling apart and sticking to her wet face. "No, Imani. Please," she begged, her voice cracking into a hoarse, pathetic, desperate whisper. "I did it for us. I did it to elevate the family. You did it entirely for yourself." I snapped back, my voice ringing with absolute crushing finality. "You spent my entire life loudly calling me a massive failure. You constantly called me a huge disappointment, because I chose to work hard for my own money instead of selling my soul and marrying into corrupt high society wealth, like your precious, perfect golden child, Aaliyah. You sat right in my own dining room just last week and smugly told me I was a bitter, miserable failure because my arrogant husband was sleeping with another woman. I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence amplify the absolute total destruction of her entire superficial worldview. But the only actual failure in this courtroom right now is you, Mom. The true ultimate failure is a mother who eagerly and willingly sold her own daughter out for a temporary seat at a lavish dinner table that was built entirely on dirty, stolen money. You traded your dignity and your soul for a massive, fraudulent empire that is currently being aggressively seized by the federal government. And now, you have absolutely nothing left to show for your lifelong betrayal. No money, no elite status, no wealthy, powerful son-in-law, and absolutely no daughter. Vivian let out a loud, strangled, agonizing cry of pure despair and slumped completely forward until her forehead was resting heavily against the polished, cold hardwood floor. She wept with the profound, absolute devastation of a woman who had just realized she had completely and permanently destroyed her own life with her own two greedy hands. I did not reach down to comfort her. I did not offer her a single reassuring word of solace or potential salvation. I simply turned my body away completely and utterly dismissing her very existence from my reality. I looked down at my left hand where the massive, flawless custom diamond engagement ring and the heavy platinum wedding band still rested securely on my finger. They were the incredibly expensive rings that Terrence had bought with stolen, laundered funds. The exact rings that were supposed to permanently bind me to his fake, pristine elite world forever. I slowly reached over with my right hand and firmly grasped the cold, heavy metal. Terrence was watching me intensely from across the wide room, still securely pinned against the dark mahogany wall by two large federal agents. His eyes were wide and painfully desperate, silently begging me not to completely sever the absolute final tangible tie between us. He was desperately waiting for me to walk over and hand the rings back to him to acknowledge his presence one last time before he was hauled away in disgrace. I deliberately held his panicked, terrified gaze as I slowly and smoothly slid the heavy diamond rings off my finger. The cold, expensive metal felt completely foreign and entirely worthless in the palm of my hand. I did not take a single step toward Terrence. Instead, I turned slightly toward the heavy wooden courtroom trash can sitting right beside the edge of the plaintiff's table. I extended my hand directly over the open rim and simply separated my fingers. The heavy, expensive platinum and the massive, flawless diamond fell straight down, hitting the bottom of the empty metal bin with a sharp, loud, hollow clatter that echoed perfectly through the quiet room. "Keep the change," I said quietly but clearly, my voice carrying effortlessly across the tense, silent space. Terrence let out a sudden, guttural, agonizing sob of absolute total defeat, his head dropping heavily and pathetically against the dark wood of the courtroom wall as the federal agents finally began to forcefully march him toward the heavy double doors. Carter was completely dead silent now, his massive, arrogant, legendary ego entirely shattered into dust, as he was hauled roughly down the center aisle behind his weeping, pathetic son-in-law. Aaliyah was still screaming hysterically on the gallery floor, thrashing wildly and uncontrollably in her expensive, ruined designer dress, while Vivian remained completely curled up in a pathetic, broken sobbing ball right at my feet. The entire fake, luxurious elite empire they had ruthlessly built to oppress and humiliate me was completely burning to unrecoverable ashes all around them. I completely ignored the shrill screaming, the desperate sobbing, and the loud clanking of cold federal steel handcuffs. I calmly turned away from the absolute magnificent wreckage of my former toxic family and looked directly up at the elevated judicial bench. I met Judge Harrison's stern, observant gaze and offered him a slow, deep, highly respectful nod. The judge nodded back silently, acknowledging the absolute, total, flawless victory of the quiet, resilient woman they had all so severely underestimated. I reached down and confidently picked up my pristine leather briefcase, my movements smooth, powerful, and entirely unbothered by the sheer, unprecedented chaos violently swirling around me. I did not look back down at my mother weeping pathetically on the floor. I did not look over at my sister screaming desperately for her arrested felon husband. I simply turned on my heel and walked with perfect, absolute composed power straight down the center aisle of the courtroom, completely leaving the screaming, burning ruins of my past permanently behind me. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed silently behind me, completely shutting out the pathetic sounds of my former family weeping and begging on the marble floor. I walked briskly down the long, polished corridor of the federal building, my heels clicking in a steady, rhythmic tempo that echoed with absolute finality. My grip on my leather briefcase was relaxed, and my breathing was perfectly deep and even. There were absolutely no tears threatening to spill from my eyes. There was no lingering sadness or heavy regret pulling at my chest. For the first time in 35 years, my shoulders felt incredibly light. I pushed open the massive glass exit doors and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. The bright, blinding afternoon sunlight immediately washed over me, warming my face and making the crisp white fabric of my tailored suit practically glow. The scene outside the federal building was already completely chaotic. Word of the massive $35 million federal takedown and the dramatic mid-hearing arrests had leaked to the local media with lightning speed. A massive swarm of aggressive reporters and determined photojournalists was gathered at the bottom of the wide concrete stairs. The loud, rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters sounded like a swarm of angry locusts as they aggressively jockeyed for position. Bright camera flashes exploded in the afternoon sun, trying desperately to capture the face of the quiet, unassuming woman who had just single-handedly dismantled one of the most powerful corrupt real estate empires in the entire city. Aggressive reporters started shouting my name, shoving heavy microphones over the metal barricades, demanding a statement about my husband and my father-in-law facing decades in federal prison. I did not pause my stride for a single second. I did not flinch at the bright flashing lights or turn my head to acknowledge their frantic shouting questions. I kept my chin raised high and my eyes locked straight ahead, completely ignoring the hungry press as I calmly descended the concrete steps with the absolute unbothered grace of a woman who held all the cards. I walked straight past the aggressive media circus, treating them as if they were entirely invisible. As I reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped onto the busy curb, a sleek, immaculate jet-black Maybach silently glided through the heavy city traffic and pulled smoothly to a stop right in front of me. The incredibly expensive luxury vehicle was completely paid for in cold, hard cash, using a tiny fraction of my tax-free $10.5 million federal whistleblower bounty. A professional chauffeur in a dark, tailored suit immediately stepped out and quickly opened the heavy, reinforced rear door for me, respectfully bowing his head as I approached. I slid gracefully into the spacious back seat, sinking into the incredibly soft, premium white leather. The chauffeur quietly closed the thick door, completely silencing the frantic shouting of the desperate reporters outside. The heavily tinted windows wrapped me in a peaceful dark cocoon of absolute privacy. I leaned my head back against the soft headrest and let out a long, slow breath as the powerful car seamlessly merged back into the heavy city traffic, driving me far away from the toxic ruins of my past. The next 7 days passed in a relentless, chaotic blur of devastating media coverage and absolute high society destruction. The brutal news cycle was completely merciless, entirely stripping away the fake, pristine image my family had spent decades ruthlessly protecting. Terrence and Carter were immediately hauled in front of a stern federal magistrate for their preliminary arraignment hearing. The heavily armed prosecutors presented a mountain of undeniable digital evidence detailing their massive international wire fraud and their extensive offshore money laundering networks. Because of the massive scale of their financial crimes and the sheer amount of hidden illegal wealth, the federal judge explicitly deemed both men extreme flight risks. They were flatly denied bail. Carter, the untouchable, arrogant real estate mogul, who had always worn custom-tailored suits and looked down his nose at the working class, was completely stripped of his dignity. He was forced to trade his expensive silk ties for a bright neon orange county jail jumpsuit. Terrence was reportedly placed in a high-security holding block, where he spent his long, cold nights weeping uncontrollably in his tiny concrete cell, completely terrified of the long, brutal decades he was about to spend behind heavy iron bars. While the men rotted in federal custody, the remaining women in my family faced their own rapid, absolutely brutal reality checks. The massive federal asset seizure swept through Aaliyah's fake, luxurious life like a devastating financial hurricane. Aggressive federal agents arrived at her massive, sprawling suburban mansion just 3 days after the courtroom arrests. They carried heavy cardboard boxes and official eviction notices, completely freezing her fraudulent assets. Aaliyah, the golden child, who had relentlessly mocked my modest lifestyle, was given exactly 2 hours to pack a single standard suitcase of basic necessities. Federal agents physically confiscated her expensive designer handbags, her vault of diamond jewelry, and the keys to her luxury imported vehicles. She was forced to stand crying on the sidewalk in a cheap pair of sweatpants, watching absolute strangers lock the heavy iron gates of her stolen estate. Completely destitute and officially homeless, she had no choice but to awkwardly move into the tiny guest bedroom of our mother's increasingly empty house. But Vivian's own desperate situation was rapidly deteriorating into absolute social oblivion. She simply could not accept that her elite, untouchable status had been entirely incinerated. Driven by pure, stubborn delusion, Vivian attempted to show her face at the highly exclusive local country club for her regular Tuesday afternoon luncheon. She walked through the heavy glass doors expecting the usual fawning attention and polite smiles. Instead, the opulent dining room went completely dead silent the moment she entered. The wealthy elite women she had spent decades desperately trying to impress slowly turned their backs on her, actively whispering behind their expensive menus about her criminal husband and her fraudulent empire. When Vivian defensively tried to order a glass of wine to save face, the manager quietly informed her that her platinum credit card had been firmly declined and her accounts were federally frozen. The absolute final crushing blow came when the club president formally approached her table and handed her a sealed white envelope officially revoking her family membership, citing the Morals and Conduct Clause. Vivian was physically escorted off the pristine country club grounds by private security guards, completely cementing her new permanent status as an absolute social pariah. I watched the beautiful chaotic fallout from the peaceful quiet comfort of my new massive high-rise penthouse apartment. I was sitting on my expansive private balcony, sipping a hot cup of expensive coffee, and watching the morning sun reflect brightly off the towering glass buildings of the city skyline. The heavy burden of trying to earn their fake toxic love was completely gone forever. I was finally entirely free. Suddenly, the quiet, peaceful morning was interrupted by the soft vibration of my new phone sitting on the glass patio table. I glanced down at the bright screen and raised a single curious eyebrow. The caller ID displayed the name Marcus, the arrogant managing partner at my old forensic accounting firm. He was the exact same boss who had constantly overlooked my brilliant financial audits, deliberately passed me over for long overdue promotions, and severely undervalued my raw talent for years. I calmly picked up the ringing phone and pressed the green button slowly, bringing the device to my ear. Imani Marcus practically shouted into the receiver, his voice completely frantic and dripping with a desperate, pathetic kind of respect he had never once shown me before. I saw the massive federal indictment news. I saw what you did to Carter's offshore accounts. Listen to me, Imani. Please, you have to come back to the firm right now. We are offering you a full senior partnership, immediate equity, and whatever massive salary you want. Please, Imani, we desperately need your mind on our team. I let his pathetic, desperate pleading hang in the heavy air for a long, incredibly satisfying moment. Marcus, the arrogant man who had explicitly stolen my brilliant financial audits and proudly handed them over to mediocre white men for years, was now practically begging on his hands and knees. He was completely panicking, watching his own pristine corporate reputation completely fracture under the massive weight of the federal scandal I had just unleashed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee, letting the rich, dark flavor completely coat my tongue as I stared out at the bright, sprawling city. "Marcus," I said, my voice completely calm, entirely flat, and completely devoid of the frantic, chaotic energy he was currently projecting through the phone. "I do not work for you anymore. I will never work for you or anyone like you ever again." He immediately tried to interrupt to rapidly throw more empty corporate promises and fake equity numbers at my face, desperately trying to buy back the absolute genius he had completely taken for granted. But I cut him off with absolute cold surgical precision. In fact, Marcus, with my massive new federal capital, I just officially opened my own independent forensic accounting firm. I paused for a second, letting that absolute crushing reality completely sink into his greedy, panicked brain. "And since you are suddenly so incredibly eager to discuss real estate and firm equity, I think you should probably check your corporate email this morning. I am currently in the absolute final stages of completely buying out your entire commercial office building. You are going to be paying your exorbitant monthly rent directly to me from now on." I did not wait for his shocked, stuttering, pathetic response. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, permanently hanging up on the man who had spent years deliberately trying to keep me small and invisible. Later that same afternoon, I drove my sleek, dark Maybach out to the quiet, peaceful cemetery, located on the lush green edge of the city. The rolling hills were perfectly shaded by massive ancient oak trees, casting long, beautiful, intricate shadows across the manicured grass. I walked slowly down the familiar winding stone path, my tailored black trench coat completely flawless and moving elegantly in the crisp afternoon wind. I finally reached the simple, elegant, polished granite headstone that proudly bore my father's name. The incredible man who had taught me absolutely everything about unyielding integrity, about working incredibly hard, and keeping my head held high even when the cruel world actively tried to drag me down. I stood there in the profound, peaceful silence, completely alone, but feeling incredibly accompanied and deeply protected by his towering memory. I reached deep into my coat pocket and gently pulled out a single pristine white rose. I laid it softly against the base of the cold, smooth stone. Then I reached into my other pocket and pulled out the heavy, solid gold vintage Rolex watch. It was the exact same beautiful watch Terrence had so arrogantly stolen and worn, like a hollow, pathetic trophy of his fake success. I knelt down and placed the heavy gold timepiece directly next to the delicate white flower, right where it truly and permanently belonged. "I cleared your name, Dad," I whispered into the quiet, rustling wind, my voice thick with absolute pure love and undeniable fierce pride. "The federal records are completely clean, and his fraudulent legacy is entirely erased. I made them pay for every single terrible thing they deliberately did to us." I stood back up slowly, wiping a single stray tear from my cheek. Not a tear of heavy grief or sadness, but a tear of absolute profound justified victory. The transition into my new extraordinary life was completely seamless and undeniably powerful. Just a few short weeks later, I was sitting extremely comfortably behind a massive custom-cut marble desk in my brand new corner penthouse office. The massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking, unobstructed panoramic view of the entire bustling, sprawling city below me. The warm afternoon sun poured generously into the massive executive room, catching the rich, deep golden undertones of my perfectly moisturized, glowing brown skin. My long, thick, beautiful locks were styled flawlessly, cascading down my back like a heavy, intricate crown of absolute royalty. I was no longer the quiet, invisible, submissive wife shrinking uncomfortably in the background of elite, restricted country club dinners. I was the absolute, undisputed apex predator of the entire forensic financial world. I reached out with a steady, perfectly manicured hand and pulled a thick, heavy manila case file toward the exact center of my pristine desk. The thick, bold black letters printed across the front cover detailed the massive, highly illegal corporate holdings of another corrupt, untouchable, arrogant billionaire who foolishly thought he could easily hide his dirty stolen money in the dark, complex shadows of offshore shell accounts. He had absolutely no idea the devastating storm that was currently coming for him. I slowly opened the heavy textured folder, my sharp, highly trained eyes instantly locking onto the tiny, deliberate financial discrepancies hidden deep within the complex columns of falsified numbers. A small, confident, knowing smile played across my lips as the beautiful, intricate puzzle began to instantly unravel right in front of my eyes. My former toxic family and all the arrogant, entitled people exactly like them had made a massive, fatal miscalculation. They thought my beautiful blackness, my quiet, observant nature, my fierce, unwavering loyalty made me somehow incredibly weak and easily disposable. They truly believed that I would just silently absorb their endless abuse and quietly fade away into the unseen background without ever putting up a fight. They completely forgot one fundamental, undeniable, universal truth. When you ruthlessly and cruelly push a highly intelligent, extremely capable woman entirely into the dark, she does not just blindly stumble around in absolute terrified fear. She patiently and meticulously learns exactly how to see every single terrible thing they are desperately trying to hide. Fade to black. The ultimate lesson from Imani's journey is that you can never build a truly beautiful life on a foundation of ugly lies and stolen money. Society often teaches us that family is absolutely everything and that we must endure endless toxic abuse just to keep the peace. But true strength is realizing that your own peace is worth far more than their fake approval. Real wealth is not found in designer clothes or country club memberships paid for with dirty money. Real wealth is unyielding integrity and the immense power of walking away from people who actively try to destroy your light. Have you ever had to permanently walk away from a highly toxic family situation to finally protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. And please subscribe for more deeply satisfying stories of ultimate justice.